Keanu Reeves selflessly gives up his first-class seat for Clint Eastwood, unaware that this simple act of kindness will change both their lives. As turbulence strikes, fear grips the passengers, and an unexpected bond forms between two Hollywood legends. What happens next is a lesson in humanity, courage, and the power of one selfless decision. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The steady hum of the airport was a familiar sound, people rushing, announcements echoing, the rhythmic rolling of suitcases against polished floors. At Terminal 7 of Serenity International Airport, passengers prepared to board a commercial flight that would take them across the country. Among them was Keanu Reeves, dressed in his usual understated style, a gray t-shirt, well-worn jeans, a black cap pulled low over his face. He wasn't trying to attract attention. In fact, he was hoping for the opposite, just another passenger in the sea of travelers. As he stepped into the first-class cabin, he felt the subtle shift in atmosphere. The seats were wider, the air cooler, and the faint scent of expensive cologne lingered in the space. Business executives adjusted their ties, a celebrity flipped through a script, and the soft clinking of glasses signaled the beginning of an indulgent journey. Keanu moved quietly to his window seat, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant who greeted him. He wasn't here for the luxury, he was here for the solitude that first class provided. Then it happened. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin like a shock wave. Heads turned, eyes widened. Even the most composed passengers reacted, their expressions shifting from indifference to awe. The murmurs carried a name that had commanded respect in Hollywood for decades. Clint Eastwood. The legendary actor, known for his steel-eyed stare and decades of cinematic brilliance, stepped onto the plane with his unmistakable presence. Though he was in his early 90s, he still carried himself like a man who had seen the world, conquered it, and remained standing. His walk was slower now, but his aura, his sheer presence, hadn't faded with time. Keanu's eyes lifted from the in-flight menu, curiosity piqued. Clint was a man he had admired since childhood, a symbol of grit and timeless storytelling. But as Keanu watched him move, he noticed something beyond the iconic image. There was a subtle wariness in Clint's expression, something that hadn't been there before. Then, a quiet but tense conversation caught Keanu's attention. A flight attendant, her posture stiff, stood next to Clint's assistant, whispering with an apologetic tone. The assistant's expression darkened. Something was wrong. "Sir, I'm so sorry," the flight attendant was saying, voice laced with regret. "There was a mix-up with the seating arrangement. Mr. Eastwood's first-class seat was reassigned due to an overbooking issue." The assistant inhaled sharply, clearly frustrated, but Clint raised a hand. A silent command to let it go. His voice, still rich with that signature growl, came steady. "It's fine, don't worry about it," he said. "But, sir," the attendant hesitated, "there are no remaining seats in first class." A brief silence filled the space, heavy with unspoken tension. First-class passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, pretending not to listen while secretly absorbing every word. Then, before anyone could react, Keanu stood up. With his usual quiet humility, he took a step toward Clint. The eyes of the cabin followed his every movement, watching the scene unfold as if it were a scripted moment in a film. "Mr. Eastwood," Keanu said, his voice warm and unwavering. "Please, take my seat. I insist." Clint turned to him, his sharp gaze locking onto Keanu's with an unreadable expression. For a moment he said nothing, just studied the younger man before him. "You sure about that, kid?" Clint asked. Keanu nodded without hesitation. "Absolutely." Clint's rough hands gripped the armrest, as if contemplating whether to accept. Keanu wasn't just any actor. He was one of the few in Hollywood who understood humility, who didn't let the industry strip away his humanity. A long pause. Finally, Clint exhaled, nodding. "All right, Reeves, if you insist." The tension broke, replaced by a murmur of disbelief. First-class passengers watched in stunned silence as Clint settled into Keanu's seat while Keanu gathered his belongings, ready to head to economy class. Clint looked up at him one last time and said, "You didn't have to do this." Keanu smiled, voice light but firm. "I wanted to." As he turned and walked down the narrow aisle toward coach, squeezing past passengers and stowing away his carry-on, he had no idea that this one small act of kindness would set off a chain reaction that neither of them could have predicted. The first-class cabin was left buzzing in the wake of Keanu's quiet yet profound gesture. Passengers exchanged whispers, their expressions shifting between admiration and curiosity. Some nodded in silent respect, acknowledging that they had just witnessed something rare, an act of humility in a place built on prestige. Clint Eastwood sat in Keanu's abandoned first-class seat, adjusting the armrest as he cast a glance toward the now disappearing figure of the younger actor. His sharp gaze followed Keanu as he made his way to economy class, a realm separated not just by a curtain, but by unspoken social barriers. Clint had spent his life portraying heroes, men of integrity and courage. But this simple moment had struck something deep within him. Keanu, now in coach, found himself wedged into a middle seat between a chatty businessman and an exhausted mother struggling to calm her crying toddler. The stark contrast between the plush leather seats of first class and the cramped rows of economy was undeniable, yet Keanu remained unfazed. The businessman to his right, a man in his late 40s wearing a crisp navy suit and gold cufflinks, gave him a once-over before raising a skeptical brow. "Man, I swear you look just like..." Keanu smiled faintly, cutting him off before the realization could land. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The businessman chuckled, clearly not convinced, but choosing to let it go. To Keanu's left, the mother gave him an apologetic glance, bouncing her tear-streaked toddler on her lap as she rifled through her bag for something to calm him. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Keanu simply shook his head, offering a warm, reassuring smile. "It's all right. Long flights are tough for little ones." The woman sighed in relief at his understanding, clearly expecting frustration instead of kindness. The baby, still fussy, reached out and grasped Keanu's finger in his tiny, sticky hand. The simple human connection made Keanu chuckle softly. Meanwhile, back in first class, Clint couldn't shake the feeling that this moment meant something more. He reached into his leather messenger bag, pulling out a small, worn-out notepad, a habit from his decades of directing and storytelling. With slow, deliberate strokes of his pen, he began jotting down his thoughts. Humility isn't spoken, it's lived. A man's worth isn't in the seat he takes, but the one he gives up. As he scribbled, his sharp eyes flicked toward the aisle, catching glimpses of Keanu's relaxed demeanor in the middle of coach. The younger actor had already engaged in quiet conversations with those around him, making people laugh, easing tension. Clint exhaled deeply, realizing that while Hollywood often told stories of heroism, true character was revealed in the small, unseen moments. But then, the plane shuddered violently. A ripple of gasps swept through the cabin as the seatbelt signs flickered on. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but tense. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering unexpected turbulence due to an incoming storm system. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Keanu sat up straighter, his instincts sharpening as the plane lurched again, dipping slightly. The toddler beside him let out a terrified wail, clinging to his mother. Even the businessman beside Keanu, who had previously exuded confidence, now gripped his armrest with white knuckles. The plane rattled, overhead bins creaking ominously. Drinks spilled in first class, and startled voices murmured prayers throughout the cabin. Back in first class, Clint felt the weight of years pressing on him. He had flown thousands of times before, but this felt different. He peered out the rain-streaked window, catching glimpses of jagged lightning slicing through the darkened clouds. He couldn't help but think of Keanu, the man who had given up his seat without hesitation, now sitting at the back of the plane enduring the same storm, if not worse. Then came the loudest jolt yet. The entire cabin gasped as the plane suddenly dipped, a gut-wrenching drop that sent loose items tumbling. A flight attendant lost her balance, catching herself just in time. The businessman beside Keanu swore under his breath. The mother beside him shut her eyes tightly, whispering soft words of reassurance to her child. Keanu reached over, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "We're going to be all right," he said, his voice steady. The sincerity in his tone cut through the panic, grounding those around him. Even the businessman, who had been gripping his armrest with growing anxiety, exhaled deeply, loosening his tense posture. But in first class, Clint wasn't as reassured. Years of life had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every fiber of his being was telling him something was wrong. Then, a loud cracking sound echoed from somewhere within the aircraft. The lights flickered, and the engines groaned against the storm. Passengers screamed, some bracing for the worst. Even in first class, where calm was a currency, faces turned pale with fear. Clint clenched his fists. This wasn't just turbulence anymore. He turned his gaze toward the back of the plane, toward the man who had been the only one to give something up today. And at that moment, Clint made a decision. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. The flight attendant rushed toward him, alarmed. "Sir, you need to stay seated." But Clint Eastwood, with the same unbreakable will that had carried him through decades of storytelling, simply looked at her and said, "I need to talk to him." With the plane still shaking, passengers whispering prayers, and uncertainty thick in the air, Clint made his way toward Keanu Reeves in economy class, completely unaware that this single decision would change the course of both their lives. Clint steadied himself against the swaying of the aircraft, gripping the seatbacks as he moved down the narrow aisle. The flight attendants, too preoccupied with securing loose items and calming anxious passengers, barely had time to stop him. The turbulence had everyone on edge, and no one expected the legendary Clint Eastwood to suddenly decide to leave the comforts of first class to navigate through a storm-tossed plane. As he reached economy, he caught sight of Keanu sitting calmly amidst the chaos, his hand still resting reassuringly on the mother's shoulder as she cradled her terrified child. The baby had finally quieted down, perhaps sensing the strange tranquility radiating from the man beside them. Keanu looked up, and for the briefest moment his brow furrowed in confusion. Then, seeing Clint standing there, bracing himself against the overhead bins, Keanu's expression softened into quiet amusement. "Didn't think you'd trade back," Keanu said, offering a small smile. Clint let out a dry chuckle, lowering himself into the empty seat across the aisle, his hands gripping the armrests as the plane jolted again. "Hell, son, I spent my whole life playing tough guys," Clint muttered, glancing around at the nervous passengers. "Figured it was time to see what it's really like." Keanu tilted his head, studying the older man's expression. There was something deeper there, something unspoken beneath the humor. Clint let out a slow breath, his sharp blue eyes momentarily distant. "You gave up your seat for me," he said, finally addressing the moment that had led them here. "You didn't even hesitate." Keanu shrugged, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Didn't feel like much of a choice." Clint studied him for a long moment, the turbulence momentarily forgotten. "Why?" Keanu glanced out the small window beside him, watching the storm clouds flash with occasional bursts of lightning. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "You ever have one of those moments where you just know, like something inside tells you this is the right thing to do?" Clint nodded slowly. He knew that feeling well. Keanu exhaled, his gaze still fixed outside. "I try not to think about the big stuff too much, just do what feels right in the moment." Clint leaned back in his seat, letting those words settle. He had spent his life telling stories of men who made choices, some heroic, some tragic, but always choices that defined them. Yet here was Keanu, as casual as if he'd just handed over an umbrella on a rainy day, speaking about an act of generosity as if it had been inevitable. "You make it sound simple," Clint murmured. Keanu chuckled under his breath. I think we make things more complicated than they need to be. The plane lurched again, and Clint instinctively gripped the armrests tighter, glancing around the cabin. A few rows ahead, a young couple sat, clutching hands so tightly that their knuckles had turned white. Behind them, an older man was murmuring something under his breath, a quiet prayer lost in the hum of the engines. Clint looked back at Keanu, who hadn't moved a muscle. There was an unmistakable steadiness about him, something rare in an industry where people thrived on ego and excess. "You know," Clint mused, his voice softer now, "I've spent my whole life trying to tell stories about men like you." Keanu finally looked at him, an eyebrow raised. "Men like me?" Clint smirked. "The quiet ones, the ones who don't ask for attention but do what's right anyway." He shook his head slightly. "Problem is, the world doesn't make movies about men like that anymore." Keanu considered this for a moment. Then, with the same humble nonchalance that had baffled the salesman in the luxury jet showroom back in video number 58, he said, "Then maybe it's time to change that." Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "You might be onto something there." For a few moments, the two men sat in comfortable silence, the turbulence outside raging while inside a strange sense of calm had settled. Then Clint's expression grew more serious. "Keanu, you ever think about legacy?" Keanu turned his gaze back to him, something shifting in his eyes. Clint continued, his voice quieter now, less like an actor and more like a man laying bare the weight of his years. "I've made my mark, sure. But sometimes I wonder if I spent too much time worrying about the wrong things, the box office numbers, the awards. I look at you, and I see a man who seems to have it figured out. But I also see someone carrying something heavy." Keanu's jaw tensed ever so slightly, his fingers tightening against his knee. Clint wasn't wrong. For a moment, Keanu debated whether to brush off the question, to deflect with his usual easygoing charm. But there was something about Clint. Something in the way he spoke, like a man who had walked the long road of life and had learned to recognize the burdens others carried, that made him pause. "My legacy isn't in the movies," Keanu said finally. "It's in the people I meet, the moments that matter." He exhaled slowly, his voice quiet but firm. "You never know how much time you have, but you do know what you can do with it." Clint studied him, nodding thoughtfully. Then, after a long silence, he muttered, "Damn, that's a hell of a thing to say." Keanu chuckled, shaking his head. "You should put it in one of your movies." Clint smirked. "Maybe I will." Just then, the intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice sounded less tense than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've navigated through the worst of the turbulence. We should be returning to smoother skies soon. Thank you for your patience." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the plane. The tension that had gripped the passengers slowly began to ease, shoulders loosening, hands unclenching. A few people even let out nervous chuckles, exchanging sheepish glances as if to say, "Well, that was something." Clint leaned back in his seat, exhaling. "Guess we made it." Keanu nodded. "Guess so." The flight attendants began moving through the aisles again, checking on passengers, offering quiet reassurances. Then Clint did something that surprised even himself. He reached out and clapped a hand on Keanu's shoulder. "Hey, you ever thought about making a movie together?" Keanu raised a brow, clearly amused. "You serious?" Clint grinned, his eyes glinting with the spark of a man who had just stumbled upon an idea too good to ignore. "Dead serious." Keanu considered it, the corners of his mouth twitching. "I don't know. I hear Hollywood's a tough business." Clint laughed, a deep, genuine laugh that hadn't surfaced in years. "Kit, you've got no idea." The two men sat there, in the calm after the storm, their conversation shifting from turbulence and legacy to something neither of them had expected. A potential future. A collaboration that neither had planned, but both now seemed to want. And just like that, a simple act of kindness had set something greater into motion, something neither of them could fully grasp yet, but both instinctively knew was going to change everything. As the plane finally steadied and the hum of normalcy returned to the cabin, Keanu and Clint exchanged a knowing glance. The turbulence had passed, but something deeper had been set in motion. Neither of them could have anticipated that one small moment of kindness, giving up a seat, would lead to an unexpected conversation about legacy, humility, and the weight of one's choices. Passengers in the surrounding seats had noticed the two men talking. Some pretended not to eavesdrop, while others discreetly stole glances, whispering among themselves. It wasn't every day that two Hollywood legends sat together in coach, discussing life like old friends. A flight attendant approached carefully, clearing her throat. "Mr. Eastwood? Mr. Reeves?" she asked hesitantly, clearly aware that she was interrupting something. Both men looked up. "There's a passenger up front," she continued, shifting slightly. She saw what happened earlier. She's been trying to work up the courage to come talk to you, Mr. Reeves." The attendant glanced at Clint. "And you too, Mr. Eastwood." Clint raised a brow, clearly intrigued, while Keanu offered a small, patient smile. "Send her over," Clint said with a slight nod. A moment later, a woman in her late 50s made her way down the aisle, clutching a leather-bound notebook tightly against her chest. She wore a simple beige sweater, and there was a nervous energy about her as she stopped in front of their row. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not at all," Keanu said warmly. "Have a seat." She hesitated before lowering herself into the aisle seat next to Clint. Up close, they could see the emotion in her eyes, a mixture of admiration, nervousness, and something else. "I just wanted to say," she took a breath, "what you did earlier, Mr. Reeves, it really meant something." Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for her to continue. She exhaled, gripping her notebook. "I lost my husband a year ago," she admitted. "He was a veteran. A huge fan of both of you." Her eyes flickered to Clint, then back to Keanu. "He always told me that kindness is rare in people who have everything, that power and money change a person. But seeing you give up your seat like that, without hesitation?" She swallowed hard. "It reminded me of him." Keanu's face softened. He had heard many stories over the years, but they never failed to hit him in the chest in ways words couldn't describe. Clint shifted slightly. "Your husband," he said gently. "What was his name?" She smiled sadly. "James. He was a good man, strong but gentle." Keanu nodded, glancing at the notebook in her hands. "Are you a writer?" Her face flushed slightly. Well, not really. I mean, I write, but it's just a personal thing, a way to keep his memory alive." Keanu glanced at Clint, who gave him a knowing look. "Can we see?" Keanu asked. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the book. "It's just thoughts," she admitted. "Little things. About James. About life." Clint leaned forward, his voice steady. "Sometimes the little things are the most important." A long silence stretched between them before she finally opened the book. Flipping to a page marked with a ribbon, she turned it toward them. Keanu took it gently, his eyes scanning the words. "Kindness is not about what we have, but what we choose to give. We are not remembered for our possessions, but for the moments we shared, the hands we held, and the people we made feel less alone." Keanu's fingers lingered on the page. "This is beautiful," he said, his voice quiet. Clint let out a small breath, nodding. "Damn good writing." She gave a small, flustered laugh. "James used to say the same thing." Keanu handed the book back, looking at her with a kind of reverence. "Thank you for sharing that with us." She pressed the notebook against her chest, nodding. "Thank you for proving my husband right, that kindness still exists." The three of them sat in quiet understanding for a moment before the woman excused herself, returning to her seat. As she walked away, Clint let out a low whistle. Well, that just about says it all, doesn't it?" Keanu exhaled, still thoughtful. "Yeah." For a while, neither of them spoke. The remainder of the flight passed in a haze of soft conversations, hushed whispers, and the occasional gaze from a fellow passenger who had witnessed the interaction. By the time the captain announced their descent, the turbulence of both the storm and the moment had settled into something deeper, a connection that neither Keanu nor Clint could have planned. As the plane touched down, the passengers clapped, politely, relieved to be back on solid ground. Keanu stretched, glancing out the window. Clint rolled his shoulders, rubbing his stiff knees. "You know," Clint mused, "I've flown on hundreds of planes in my lifetime. But this one," he smirked, "might be the most memorable." Keanu let out a soft chuckle. "Yeah, I'd say so." As they stood to retrieve their bags, Keanu felt a small tug on his sleeve. He turned to see a young boy, no older than 10, staring up at him with wide, eager eyes. "Are you really John Wick?" the boy whispered. Clint let out a laugh. Keanu smiled, kneeling slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "I guess I am." The boy's face lit up, and from behind him, his father smiled warmly. "Thank you for what you did today," the man said. A lot of people noticed. Keanu only nodded, patting the boy's shoulder before standing again. As they made their way toward the exit, Clint shook his head with amusement. "Kid, you might just be the realest damn movie star I've ever met." Keanu only chuckled. "I try." But just as they reached the terminal, something happened that neither of them expected. A flight attendant, the same one who had approached them earlier, held up her phone. "Mr. Reeves? Mr. Eastwood, I just thought you should know." She turned the screen toward them. There, plastered across social media, was a photo of Keanu standing in coach, giving up his seat to Clint Eastwood. The caption read, "Keanu Reeves just gave up his first-class seat for Clint Eastwood. If this isn't class, I don't know what is." The post had already gone viral, thousands of shares, hundreds of thousands of likes, comments flooding in. Clint let out a groan, rubbing his temples. "Ah, hell, here we go." Keanu smirked. "Didn't see that coming." The flight attendant laughed. "Well, you should probably brace yourself. The whole world just saw what happened on this flight." Clint glanced at Keanu. "Still think kindness is a small thing?" Keanu chuckled, shouldering his bag. "Guess not." As they stepped into the bustling airport, neither of them could have predicted what would come next. What had started as a simple act of kindness on a plane was about to turn into something much, much bigger. And neither of them would ever see the world quite the same way again. As Keanu and Clint stepped into the terminal, the noise of the airport surrounded them. Announcements blaring over the intercom, the chatter of passengers, the rhythmic hum of rolling suitcases. But something had shifted. The moment their feet touched the polished floor, the energy around them felt different. People were staring, not the usual discreet glances celebrities received, but open, wide-eyed stares, some with admiration, others with sheer disbelief. Phone cameras were raised, whispers turned into murmurs, and within seconds, a small crowd began to gather. Clint let out a long, knowing sigh. "Damn social media," he muttered. Keanu glanced around, realizing that the flight attendant had been right. The photo of him giving up his seat had exploded online, and now it was no longer just a passing act of kindness. It was a viral phenomenon. A young man approached, his hands shaking slightly as he held up his phone. "Mr. Reeves, Mr. Eastwood," he stammered. "I just wanted to say, what you did back there, it meant a lot." Keanu gave him a small nod, offering the same humble, genuine smile he always did when strangers approached him. "Thank you." The young man hesitated. "Can I, just shake your hand?" Keanu extended his hand without hesitation, and the young man grasped it tightly, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I saw my dad do the same thing once," he said. "He gave up his seat for an elderly man on a train when I was a kid. I never forgot it." Keanu's gaze softened. "Sounds like he's a good man." The young man nodded. He was. Clint watched the exchange in silence, his expression unreadable, but there was a knowing flicker in his eyes. A silent understanding of how one seemingly small action could awaken something powerful in people. But before they could take another step, a reporter appeared. "Mr. Reeves? Mr. Eastwood," she called out, weaving her way through the small but growing crowd. She was holding a microphone, her cameraman close behind. Keanu winced inwardly. He wasn't a fan of sudden media attention. He had always been one to keep his life private, to avoid the unnecessary limelight. But it was clear that this story was no longer something he could contain. The reporter, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an eager expression, stepped forward, microphone extended. "Could we have a moment? Everyone is talking about what happened on your flight. The world wants to hear your thoughts." Clint, ever the seasoned Hollywood veteran, crossed his arms and smirked slightly. "The world, huh? Didn't realize we had such an audience." The reporter smiled. "Well, when a major star like Keanu Reeves gives up a first-class seat for a legend like Clint Eastwood, people tend to pay attention." Keanu sighed softly and ran a hand through his hair, clearly contemplating how to respond. Finally, he looked at the camera. "It wasn't a big deal," he said simply. "Just felt like the right thing to do." The reporter's eyebrows lifted. "But the impact has been massive. People online are calling it a lesson in humility, a reminder of what real class looks like." "Did you expect this kind of reaction?" Keanu shook his head. "Not at all." Clint chuckled, stepping in. "Look, lady, I've been in this business long enough to know that the smallest gestures tend to have the biggest impact. People see something decent in the world, and they hold on to it because, well, let's face it, there's not enough of it these days." The reporter nodded eagerly. "And that's exactly why this story is resonating. Mr. Reeves, you've always been known for your kindness, but do you ever feel the pressure of being labeled the most humble celebrity in Hollywood?" Keanu let out a small laugh. "That's quite a title." He glanced at Clint, who smirked. "I don't think of myself that way. I just believe in treating people with respect, no matter who they are." The reporter seemed satisfied, but before she could ask another question, something unexpected happened. A man in his 60s, dressed in a faded leather jacket and jeans, stepped forward from the crowd. His eyes were filled with something deeper than admiration. Gratitude. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Mr. Reeves." Keanu and Clint turned to him, sensing that this wasn't just another fan encounter. I had to say something," the man continued, his fingers twitching slightly. "I was on that flight too. I was sitting a few rows back. I saw the whole thing." Keanu remained silent, allowing the man to continue. "I spent my whole life working hard," the man said. "But somewhere along the way I lost sight of what really mattered. My wife used to tell me that it's the small things that define a person, the way you treat a stranger, the way you lift others up when you don't have to." He swallowed hard. "I lost her last year." Clint's expression shifted ever so slightly, the weight of the man's words settling in. "She always told me that kindness is the one thing that never loses its value," the man continued. "And when I saw what you did for each other on that flight, I swear, it felt like she was reminding me of what she always believed in." The crowd around them fell silent, hanging on to every word. "I've been angry for a long time," the man admitted. "At life, at people. But watching you two, it reminded me that there's still good out there, and that maybe, just maybe, it's not too late for me to be that kind of person, too." Keanu's throat tightened. Before he could say anything, Clint reached out, placing a firm hand on the man's shoulder. "It's never too late," Clint said, his voice steady, full of experience, loss, and wisdom. The man exhaled, nodding. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. Keanu finally spoke. "No," he said softly. "Thank you." The man nodded one last time before stepping back into the crowd. The energy around them had completely changed. It was no longer about two celebrities. It was about something bigger. A reminder that kindness had the power to reach into the hearts of strangers, to heal wounds they didn't even know were still open. The reporter, who had been silent up until now, wiped at the corner of her eye discreetly before clearing her throat. I think that's all we need." Clint smirked. "Good choice." As the cameraman lowered his equipment, Keanu and Clint finally turned to each other. "Well, kid," Clint said, exhaling, "you didn't just give up a seat. You started something bigger than you'll ever realize." Keanu let out a small, thoughtful chuckle. "Guess so." As they finally made their way toward baggage claim, the weight of what had happened still lingered. Keanu Reeves had never sought out attention. He had never aimed to be a symbol of humility or kindness. But as he walked through the airport that day, feeling the quiet stares of people who had just witnessed something truly meaningful, he realized something. Kindness wasn't just a choice, it was a responsibility. And sometimes, the smallest act could change everything. Keanu and Clint finally made their way out of the terminal, stepping into the crisp evening air where a black car waited to take them to their destinations. The excitement inside the airport was still buzzing, but now, instead of feeling the weight of the attention, Keanu carried something else. A deep realization. As they slid into the back seat of the vehicle, Clint let out a slow exhale and adjusted his hat. "Hell of a day, huh?" Keanu, staring out the window as city lights flickered by, nodded. "Yeah." His voice was quiet, but not in the way that signaled exhaustion. Instead, it was the quiet of someone reflecting on something much greater than himself. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city moved around them, horns honking, pedestrians laughing as they strolled down the sidewalks. It was just another night in the world. But inside the car, it felt like something had shifted. Clint glanced at Keanu, studying him. "Something on your mind, kid?" Keanu turned, his lips pressing together in thought before he finally spoke. "It's just, I didn't think something so small could mean so much." He shook his head slightly, still trying to grasp the enormity of it all. "I just gave up a seat, Clint. But that man back there..." Clint nodded knowingly. "Yeah, that man back there. The man at the airport, the one who had approached them with trembling hands and an open heart, was proof that what had happened on the plane wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a reminder that the smallest act of kindness had the power to reach into places no one could see, to change something in a person that had long been buried beneath time, loss, and regret." Keanu sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It makes me wonder, how many people are out there just waiting for something like this?" Clint let out a low chuckle. "More than we realize, kid. More than we realize." The car slowed as they approached a traffic light, the red glow illuminating the windshield. Keanu's phone vibrated in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, he was surprised to see hundreds of messages flooding his notifications. The world had taken notice. News articles, viral tweets, social media posts. The story was everywhere. People were calling it the power of one, a phrase that seemed to capture exactly what had happened. One moment, one seat, one act of kindness. And now, it was inspiring thousands. Keanu turned the phone over in his hand, staring at it for a long time before looking back at Clint. "Does it ever feel overwhelming?" Clint smirked, his weathered face full of wisdom. "You mean knowing that something you did, something you didn't even think twice about, is now bigger than you?" Keanu nodded. Clint shrugged. "It's not about whether it feels overwhelming. It's about what you do with it." Keanu let Clint's words settle for a moment. Then a thought struck him. "What if we did something with it?" Clint arched an eyebrow. "Oh?" Keanu sat up straighter. "People are already talking about this. What if we used it, not for attention, not for some publicity stunt, but to keep it going?" Clint finished for him, nodding slowly as realization dawned on him. "Yeah," Keanu said, his voice stronger now, conviction settling into his bones. "We start something, a movement, a project. Something that reminds people that kindness still exists, that it matters, that the smallest thing can change someone's world." Clint considered this, then leaned back with a grin. You know, Reeves, for a guy who avoids the spotlight, you sure do have a way of getting pulled into it." Keanu chuckled. "Yeah, guess I do." The car rolled to a stop outside Clint's destination, and as he reached for the door handle, he paused. "If you're serious about this," he said, "then you'd better be ready, because if there's one thing I know about people, it's that they're desperate for something real." Keanu nodded. "I'm serious." Clint smirked. "Then let's make it happen." And with that, the seed of something new was planted. The power of one. It had started with a seat on a plane, but now it was about to become so much more. As Keanu watched Clint step out of the car, he realized something. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't even just about Clint. It was about everyone. And it was only the beginning. In a world where people are often too busy to notice the small moments, this story serves as a powerful reminder that even the simplest act of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. Keanu Reeves' decision to give up his first-class seat for Clint Eastwood wasn't just about comfort. It was about respect, humility, and human connection. And in return, it sparked something far greater than he ever imagined. What started as a selfless gesture on an airplane became a global movement, proving that kindness still has the power to break barriers, unite people, and inspire meaningful change. It reminds us that we don't need fame, fortune, or power to make a difference. We just need the willingness to act. So let this be more than just a story. Let it be a challenge to choose kindness, to recognize the unseen struggles of those around us, and to embrace the idea that even the smallest act can change someone's world. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the impact that a single person can have, then take a moment to spread this message. Like, share, and subscribe to keep these incredible stories alive. And most importantly, tell us in the comments. What's one act of kindness you've experienced or given that changed everything? Together, we can prove that one action, one decision, one person can make all the difference. Keanu Reeves walks into one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, dressed in simple, slightly wrinkled clothes, blending in as just another ordinary guest. He chooses a quiet table, unaware that his presence alone has already drawn judgmental stares. Before he even has a chance to place his order, a waitress, her posture laced with arrogance, approaches with a condescending smirk. What follows is a shocking display of disrespect, one that will leave the entire restaurant speechless when the truth is revealed. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The golden glow of the Lumiere restaurant spilled onto the polished streets of Beverly Hills, where the night air buzzed with the chatter of the city's elite. Inside, beneath the glimmer of a massive crystal chandelier, servers glided effortlessly between white-clothed tables, balancing silver trays with impeccable precision. The clinking of fine glassware, the low murmur of conversations between CEOs and celebrities, and the faint melody from a grand piano set the perfect stage for exclusivity. Here, every detail whispered luxury, and those who dined within these walls knew it. The double doors swung open and a man stepped inside. He walked with an unhurried ease, his hands tucked into the pockets of faded jeans, his wrinkled gray shirt loose over his frame, and his worn-out cap pulled low over his brow. His entrance did not command attention the way other guests did. There was no extravagant watch gleaming on his wrist, no designer logo stitched onto his clothing, no entourage of assistants ensuring his every step was flawless. He was, by all accounts, ordinary, which in a place like Lumiere meant he was immediately out of place. At the reception desk, Madison, one of the restaurant's most seasoned waitresses, glanced up from a conversation with a VIP guest. She caught sight of the man and her smile faltered for just a second. With years of experience, she had developed an instinct, a finely honed ability to judge customers at first glance. Her eyes flicked over his appearance. Scuffed boots, simple attire, no sign of wealth. Her judgment was swift and final. He didn't belong here. Still, Madison smoothed the irritation from her face, replacing it with a polite, albeit practiced, smile, and approached him with an air of restrained condescension. Standing in front of him, she tilted her head slightly, her voice silk-wrapped in sarcasm as she asked, "Are you sure you can afford to be here?" The words hung in the air, sharp enough to slice through the restaurant's refined atmosphere. A few guests turned their heads, their expressions flickering between amusement and curiosity. Madison didn't care. She had already decided how this night would go. But what she didn't know, what no one in that restaurant knew, was that she had just made the biggest mistake of her career. Keanu Reeves didn't flinch. He had faced arrogance before, on movie sets, in boardrooms, even walking the streets of Hollywood. But here, standing in the heart of Lumiere Restaurant, the disdain dripping from Madison's words wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The way she looked at him, the way she arched her perfectly sculpted brow, the way she allowed the corners of her lips to curl in barely concealed amusement, all of it made her intentions clear. Keanu, however, simply smiled. It was a calm, knowing smile, the kind that disarmed and unsettled in equal measure. "Yes, I'm sure," he said, his voice as steady as the flickering candlelight on the tables around him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. Not to prove anything, but to end the conversation before it began. Madison blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his lack of defensiveness. For a brief second, doubt flickered across her face. Was she wrong about him? No, that was impossible. "All right then," she said, her polished voice regaining its edge. "Just a moment, I need to check something." With exaggerated purpose, she spun on her heel and strode toward the host's podium, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Behind the desk, the reservation system glowed softly, waiting for input. But instead of checking for his name, she already knew it wouldn't be there. Madison took her time, typing slowly, pretending to search, just long enough to make him feel unwelcome. Across the room, a few patrons had begun watching the scene unfold. A well-dressed couple at the bar exchanged amused glances, while an elderly gentleman dining alone narrowed his eyes, displeased. Keanu, meanwhile, remained exactly where he was, hands in his pockets, observing the restaurant with quiet curiosity. He wasn't blind to the stares, nor to Madison's theatrics. At last, Madison let out a mock sigh of disappointment and turned back toward him. "As I suspected, you don't have a reservation," she announced, her voice carrying just enough volume for nearby guests to hear. "But we do have a few tables available." She let the words hang there, waiting for him to reconsider, waiting for him to feel small. When he didn't, when he merely nodded and said, "That sounds great," she felt a pang of irritation. Why isn't he uncomfortable? With a tight-lipped smile, she grabbed a menu and motioned for him to follow. But instead of leading him toward the grand dining hall, where chandeliers cast golden light over meticulously arranged tables, she took a sharp turn left. Through the lavish interior, past the elegantly dressed patrons, past the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city's skyline, Madison led Keanu away. The further they went, the dimmer the lights became. The chatter of the restaurant faded behind them, replaced by the distant clatter of kitchen utensils. The luxurious ambiance gave way to a more hidden corner, one near the kitchen doors, where the air was tinged with the scent of simmering sauces and the sound of plates being stacked. Finally, they arrived at a cramped table, one of the least desirable spots in the entire restaurant. It was tucked near a service station, half hidden from view, where waiters rushed past balancing trays, barely sparing a glance at the customers seated there. Madison dropped the menu onto the table with a careless flick of her wrist. "Here you go. This table should be suitable for you," she said, her smile thin and insincere. Keanu glanced around, taking in the placement, the noise, the obvious attempt to diminish him, but his expression remained unchanged. If anything, he looked mildly amused. He pulled out the chair, sat down, and unfolded the menu with deliberate ease. "Thank you," he said, his tone calm, unwavering. Madison narrowed her eyes, searching for any sign of discomfort, of frustration, of protest. She found none. "Let me know if you need anything," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "But only if it's necessary, okay?" With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, already convinced of how this would end. She knew his type. He wouldn't last 5 minutes. The moment he saw the menu, the moment he realized the prices were far beyond what he expected, he'd wave her over, mumble an excuse, and scurry out the door. Madison smirked to herself as she returned to the front of the restaurant. She had seen this play out before. But what she didn't know, what she could never have predicted, was that Keanu Reeves wasn't playing the part she imagined, and the next act of the night was about to change everything. Keanu Reeves sat in the dimly lit corner of Lumiere, the bustling restaurant continuing its elegant performance around him. The low hum of conversation, the delicate chime of silverware against fine china, and the occasional laugh from well-dressed patrons filled the space. He observed the grand dining hall from his small, secluded table, watching as waiters in pristine uniforms glided effortlessly between tables, catering to guests who fit the restaurant's unspoken but well-established profile. His presence, however, was an anomaly in this world of opulence, a quiet contrast that was both intentional and telling. Across the room, Madison hovered near the bar, a smug expression playing on her lips as she observed him from a distance. She had done this before, seated unworthy guests in the worst spots, made them wait long enough for discomfort to set in, and watched as they left, embarrassed and defeated. In her mind, Keanu was no different. Let's see how long he lasts. Instead of taking his order, she prioritized more important guests. She walked over to a charming couple in designer attire, engaging in friendly conversation as she refilled their wine glasses. She stopped by another table, laughing at a joke from a man in a tailored navy suit, taking extra care to ensure his meal was to his liking. Every so often, she passed Keanu's table, her movements rehearsed and indifferent, as if he didn't exist. Minutes passed, then 10. Then Keanu remained still, his posture relaxed, unbothered by the delay. He took in the details of the restaurant, the soft golden glow from the chandeliers, the polished wood of the tables, the carefully arranged floral centerpieces. He didn't fidget, didn't wave her down, didn't check the time on his phone. This agitated Madison. She had expected discomfort, impatience, maybe even a desperate attempt to get her attention, but nothing. His stillness made her feel as though she was the one being tested. Finally, she approached, pulling out her notepad with a dramatic sigh. "Well," she said, feigning a professional tone, "I see you're still here." Keanu looked up, his expression calm, unshaken. "Yes," he said simply. Madison tapped her pen against the notepad. "Have you decided what you'd like?" Keanu's eyes skimmed the menu leisurely before he spoke. "The filet de Rossini sounds excellent." Her lips twitched in amusement. She had expected him to order something cheap and safe, a basic salad or a small soup, something within the reach of someone who didn't belong here. But instead, he had chosen one of the most expensive dishes on the menu. She let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, of course, a classic choice," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with condescension. Then, tilting her head, she added, "Just to confirm, you do know this dish costs $350, right?" Keanu nodded, completely unfazed. "Yes, it sounds wonderful." She studied his expression, searching for hesitation, a flicker of insecurity, a sign that he had made a mistake. Nothing. Her fingers gripped the notepad a little tighter. "All right then," she said, scribbling down the order. "Just to make sure there aren't any misunderstandings later, I suggest you double-check the prices. We wouldn't want anyone to be unpleasantly surprised." Keanu met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I'm certain." Madison exhaled sharply, masking her growing frustration with a forced smile. "Very well," she said, snapping her notepad shut. "But I should warn you, our chef prefers his dishes to be enjoyed by those who truly appreciate fine dining. I hope it meets your expectations." She spun on her heel, but before leaving, she turned back one last time. "Oh, and one more thing," she added with a smirk. "The minimum tip expected here is 20%. Keep that in mind while you enjoy." With that, she strode away, convinced that he would regret this decision. Keanu, however, merely glanced down at the menu, running his fingers along the fine print. He could feel the eyes of others on him, some watching with curiosity, others with disapproval, and a few with something close to admiration. Near the bar, the elderly gentleman in the navy blue suit had been observing Madison's behavior from the start. He placed his wine glass down and let out a quiet sigh, shaking his head. At the opposite end of the room, a middle-aged woman dining with her husband turned to whisper. "He's awful," the woman murmured, shaking her head. "He's been nothing but polite." The man nodded. "She's trying to humiliate him." A few other patrons had also noticed. The tension in the air was growing, unspoken but undeniable. And yet, Keanu remained completely at ease. Minutes later, Madison returned with his appetizer. She placed the plate down with unnecessary force, causing it to slide slightly across the table. "Here's your appetizer," she said flatly. "I hope you enjoy it, or at least know what you're eating." Keanu picked up his fork, examining the dish with appreciation. "Thank you," he said, his tone sincere. Madison hesitated, waiting for him to react, to show discomfort, confusion, anything. When he didn't, she leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You know, a lot of customers who order this dish end up not liking it. It's not exactly mainstream." She gave a pointed smirk. "But I think you'll do just fine." Keanu met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "It looks excellent. Thank you for your attention." The words should have been harmless, but something about the way he said them, calm, steady, utterly unshaken, made Madison's stomach twist. She turned away quickly, heading back toward the bar, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. At the far end of the dining room, the elderly gentleman lifted his glass in a subtle toast toward Keanu, acknowledging his composure. Keanu, noticing the gesture, gave a slight nod in return. The night had only just begun, and Madison had no idea what was coming next. The tension in Lumiere was beginning to thicken, an unspoken weight in the air that many of the restaurant's guests could feel, even if they weren't directly involved. Keanu Reeves remained calm, his posture relaxed, his demeanor unchanged, while Madison, the waitress who had taken it upon herself to remind him that he did not belong, was growing. Her game was not playing out as expected. Keanu had neither lashed out nor leapt in frustration. He was not embarrassed. He was not uncomfortable. And that, more than anything, infuriated her. Determined to break him, she decided to make him wait even longer for his main course. Instead of taking the order promptly to the kitchen, she lingered around the tables of the high-prefaced guests, tending to them with unnecessary attentiveness. She refilled wine glasses that were barely touched, took the time to listen to an elderly man's long-winded story about his time in Paris, and even paused to adjust the already perfect placement of silverware at an empty table. All while Keanu waited and waited. Yet he never once looked impatient. Instead, he took in the scene around him, watching as the evening unfolded, with an expression that was almost amused. Other patrons, however, had noticed the delay. The elderly gentleman in the navy mule suit who had earlier toasted in Keanu's direction now leaned slightly toward a younger man seated at his table. "Have you noticed?" he murmured. The younger man nodded. "She's avoiding him, on purpose." A couple across the room exchanged a look. The woman, elegantly dressed in a black gown, whispered to her husband, "This is disgraceful. He's been so polite." Her husband frowned. "She thinks she's in control, but I have a feeling she's making a mistake." Back at the bar, a junior waiter, a young man named Ethan who had witnessed the entire situation unfold, could no longer contain his discomfort. He turned to Sophia, one of the senior waitresses, who had also been keeping an eye on the exchange. "Why is she doing this?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "The guy hasn't done anything wrong." Sophia sighed, crossing her arms. "Madison likes feeling superior," she said. She plays these games sometimes. She chooses someone she thinks doesn't belong and pushes them until they either snap or leave. Ethan shook his head. But it's Keanu Reeves. Sophia chuckled, though there was little humor in it. She doesn't realize that yet. Finally, after 45 minutes, Madison decided it was time to serve the main course. But first, she let the dish sit under the kitchen's warming lamps for 5 full minutes, allowing it to cool just enough to lose its ideal temperature. Then, with an air of forced politeness, she carried it out into the dining room and made a deliberate show of placing it in front of Keanu. "Your filet de Rossini, sir," she announced, her tone dripping with mock politeness as she set the plate down with an audible thud. Keanu looked at the dish and then back up at her, his expression unreadable. "I hope it meets your expectations," she continued, arms crossed. Then, leaning in ever so slightly, she lowered her voice. "It's a very sophisticated dish. It might be a bit challenging for someone who's not used to this kind of dining experience." A long silence. And then Keanu smiled. A simple, calm, genuine smile. "Thank you," he said, his voice smooth and unwavering. "I'm sure it will be excellent." Madison's stomach twisted. She hated that smile, hated that nothing she did seemed to shake him. As she walked away, she passed Ethan at the bar, who gave her a look that was half pity, half amusement. "Still waiting for him to break?" he muttered. Madison glared at him. "He will." But deep down she was beginning to doubt it. From across the room, the elderly gentleman watched, sipping his wine. His lips curled into a knowing smile. Keanu Reeves was not just another customer, and Madison had no idea who she was dealing with. The dining room at Lumiere had settled into a rhythm of quiet conversations and clinking glasses. But despite the usual elegance that filled the space, something felt off. A strange tension hummed in the background, most noticeably among those who had witnessed the way Madison had treated the lone diner in the farthest corner. Keanu Reeves, despite being the target of her disdain, remained composed, unshaken, his posture relaxed, his expression calm. He enjoyed his meal without complaint, unbothered by the obvious attempts to undermine his presence. Madison, on the other hand, was growing increasingly frustrated. Why wasn't he reacting? She had expected irritation, awkwardness, maybe even embarrassment. She wanted to force him into a situation where he felt small, like he had no right to sit among the wealthy and elite of Beverly Hills. Yet, the more she pushed, the less he seemed to care, and that infuriated her. But she still had one last move: the bill. With an exaggerated sense of authority, she strode back to his table, her heels clicking against the polished floor with purpose. In her hands she held the receipt, which she had deliberately printed early, long before he had finished his meal. She wanted him to see the number at the bottom. She wanted him to hesitate, to fumble with his wallet, to realize that he had made a mistake by choosing to dine at a place that was far beyond his means. She placed the bill down with deliberate force, ensuring the nearby tables heard the faint slap of paper against the tablecloth. "Here's your check, sir," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "Take your time." And then she waited. This was it. Keanu picked up the receipt slowly, his fingers moving with the same effortless grace that had frustrated her all evening. He scanned the numbers, his expression revealing nothing. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and removed a black credit card. Not just any credit card. A Centurion card? The American Express black card. The moment he placed it on the table, a hush fell over the nearby guests. Those who recognized it exchanged stunned glances. A card like that was invitation only, reserved for ultra-high net worth individuals. Madison, however, had no clue. She simply assumed it was another ordinary card. "Are you sure?" she said, her lips curling slightly. "It's quite a bill." Keanu met her gaze, his expression gentle but unwavering. "I'm sure." She snatched the card from the table, walking away with what she thought was victory, still believing that she had humiliated a man who didn't belong. But that illusion shattered the moment she reached the payment terminal. The second the card's distinctive matte black surface slid into the machine, the screen lit up with a special authorization prompt, one that only came up for elite-tier members. The restaurant manager, Christopher Hawthorne, had just returned from a meeting upstairs when he happened to glance toward the register. The second his eyes landed on the screen, his stomach dropped. He froze. Then, in an instant, he rushed forward. Who gave you this card?" he demanded, his voice urgent, almost panicked. Madison blinked, confused by his sudden reaction. "Some guy in the corner," she said dismissively. "Why?" The manager's face paled. He turned toward the dining room, scanning the space with growing horror. His eyes landed on Keanu Reeves. His breath caught. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed, his voice low but filled with barely restrained panic. "Do you even know who that is?" Madison frowned. "What do you mean? He's just—" The realization hit her like a slap. Christopher took a slow, measured step toward her, his tone now dangerously low. "That man," he said, barely above a whisper, "owns this restaurant." Madison stopped breathing. The words did not register. She shook her head, her laugh uneasy. "No, that's not possible." Christopher stared at her. "It's not just possible, it's a fact." Madison's hands began to tremble. Her stomach twisted painfully as she turned back toward the man she had spent the entire evening mocking, humiliating, and dismissing. Keanu Reeves. Not just a guest. Not just a wealthy man. The owner. The realization settled over her like a crushing weight, making it suddenly very difficult to breathe. And that's when Keanu, having finished his meal, finally stood up. Keanu Reeves stood up slowly, his movements deliberate yet effortless. The air in Lumiere had shifted. It was electric, heavy with realization. The conversations that once filled the lavish restaurant had all but ceased, replaced by an uneasy silence. All eyes followed his every move. The man who had been dismissed, humiliated, and belittled was now the center of the entire room's attention. Madison felt paralyzed. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, drowning out the delicate violin music that had once felt like the very heartbeat of the restaurant. The mockery, the condescension, the thinly veiled insults. Every single moment played back in her mind with excruciating clarity. And now she knew. The man she had spent the entire evening trying to push out of the restaurant, the one she assumed was a nobody, was not only one of the wealthiest actors in the world, but the man who owned the very floor she stood on. Keanu took a step forward, and though his expression remained calm, almost serene, there was an undeniable gravity in the way he carried himself. He had never raised his voice, never once snapped back at her cruel remarks, but at that moment, his presence alone spoke volumes. The restaurant manager, Christopher, was the first to break the silence. His voice was low but urgent, his posture one of pure regret. "Reeves," he said, stepping forward with palpable nervousness. "I had no idea you were dining with us tonight. If I had known, Keanu lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His gaze never wavered from Madison, who was now visibly shaking. Christopher swallowed hard before turning his attention toward her. His tone, now firm, left no room for argument. "Madison," he said, "do you realize what you've done?" Madison opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her throat was dry, her stomach twisting painfully. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Keanu finally spoke, his voice gentle, yet unwavering. "That's the problem," he said simply. Madison winced. "This was never about who I am," Keanu continued, his tone carrying a quiet authority that filled the room. "It was about how you decided to treat someone you believed didn't belong." The weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Nearby, guests exchanged glances, some ashamed, some impressed, some stunned. Madison felt her chest tighten, the sheer magnitude of her mistake crushing her from the inside out. She had spent years perfecting her flawless professional image, believing she had an innate talent for reading people. And yet, in a single evening, She had made the worst assumption of her life. Keanu continued, his gaze still fixed on her. You judged me based on my clothes, my appearance. You assumed I didn't belong here, and you treated me accordingly. He let the statement linger, allowing her to fully absorb it before delivering the final blow. Tell me, Madison, if I had actually been just another customer, someone who wasn't rich, wasn't famous, would you have treated me any differently? Madison felt the breath leave her lungs, because she knew the answer, and so did everyone else. She had no defense, no excuse that could justify what she had done. The harsh reality of her actions had finally caught up with her. Christopher exhaled deeply before speaking. Mr. Reeves, on behalf of Lumiere, I sincerely apologize for this unacceptable behavior. I take full responsibility for what happened tonight. But Keanu simply shook his head. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about how people are treated, whether they have money or not, whether they look the part or not. His eyes softened slightly, but the message remained clear. A restaurant like this isn't just about the food or the luxury. It's about the experience, the way people feel when they walk in. And tonight, you showed that some people are made to feel less than others. You know, Madison felt the first tear slip down her cheek. The humiliation was unbearable. She whispered, her voice barely audible. But Keanu, ever gracious, didn't let the moment turn into something vengeful. Instead, he sighed softly, his expression unreadable. I don't believe in shaming people, he said. I believe in learning from our mistakes. Madison slowly lifted her head, tears welling in her eyes. You have a choice, Keanu said, his voice kind but firm. You can let this moment define you, or you can learn from it. Madison swallowed hard, nodding through her tears. I understand, she whispered, her voice breaking. Keanu gave a small nod before finally stepping back. Good, he said simply. And with that, he turned toward the door, leaving the restaurant in absolute silence. But the impact of his words would stay with them forever. The air inside Lumiere remained thick with silence long after Keanu Reeves had left the restaurant. The polished silverware resting on fine linen, the soft glow of the chandeliers, the hushed murmurs of the privileged patrons. None of it could mask the lingering weight of what had just transpired. Madison stood frozen near the reception desk, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She had never felt this exposed before. The once confident waitress, who had prided herself on her ability to judge people, now found herself standing at the center of a painful lesson. One that had unfolded in front of an audience of high-prefaced diners and her own colleagues. No amount of rehearsed charm, polished manners, or quick wit could save her now. Christopher, the restaurant manager, sighed deeply, rubbing his temple as he turned to address the stunned waitstaff. His disappointment was evident. Everyone, he said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the whispered conversations. Tonight was a failure. No one dared to move. A failure, he continued, scanning the faces of the employees, of respect, of professionalism, and of the very values this restaurant is supposed to uphold. His gaze finally landed on Madison, who lowered her eyes, heat crawling up her neck as shame settled deep into her chest. Christopher's voice softened, but it didn't lose its authority. This wasn't just about one customer. This was about how we treat people. What happened tonight proves that some of us have forgotten what hospitality really means. Some of the other staff shifted uncomfortably, their expressions filled with unease. A few had witnessed the way Madison had treated Keanu. Some had even agreed with her assessment at first. But now, knowing who he was didn't change the fact that they had stood by and done nothing. Madison finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. I didn't know, she said, her throat tightening as regret consumed her. Christopher exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. That's the problem, Madison, he said. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. She winced, his words hitting harder than she expected. I thought I was upholding our standards, she tried to explain, her voice shaking. I thought I was... Christopher shook his head. No, you weren't upholding standards. You were making assumptions. You were deciding who was worthy of good service and who wasn't. Madison looked away, her vision blurring with tears. And let me be clear, Christopher added, his tone sharp, this is not how we operate at Lumiere. A murmur rippled through the staff, a mixture of guilt and understanding settling among them. Some, like Madison, had unknowingly absorbed this toxic mindset, judging customers based on their appearance, their perceived status, and how well they fit into the world of high-end luxury. But tonight, that illusion had been shattered. Madison swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. I was wrong. Christopher's gaze remained steady, his disappointment still evident, but his tone softened slightly. Now he said, "What are you going to do about it?" And at that moment, Madison knew that her answer would define more than just her career. It would define the kind of person she wanted to be. The once lively ambience of Lumiere had dimmed, leaving behind an air of awkward reflection. Madison stood in silence, her once confident demeanor replaced with the weight of humility and regret. She had spent years perfecting her image, believing she was the gatekeeper of exclusivity, the silent judge of who belonged and who didn't. But now, she realized how misguided that belief had been. Christopher's words still echoed in her mind. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with respect. That truth hit harder than she ever expected. Looking around, Madison noticed that many of her colleagues wore similar expressions of discomfort. Some had remained silent witnesses to her actions that evening, unwilling or too indifferent to intervene. Others had been just as complicit in creating a culture of judgment rather than hospitality. As she stood there, she finally spoke, her voice quiet but sincere. "I want to do better," she said, lifting her gaze to Christopher. "I don't want to be that person anymore." Christopher studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Good," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Because from now on, this restaurant will hold itself to a higher standard, and that starts with every single one of us." The staff exchanged glances, understanding the unspoken message. Tonight had been a turning point, one that would change not only Madison, but the entire restaurant itself. As for Keanu Reeves, he had left behind more than just a lesson. He had left behind a legacy of kindness, respect, and a reminder that true worth is never measured by appearance. This story is a powerful reminder that true value lies not in appearance, wealth, or status, but in how we treat one another. Keanu Reeves didn't demand respect. He simply expected the basic dignity that every human being deserves. Yet, through patience and quiet strength, he turned a moment of disrespect into a lesson that would not be forgotten. In a world where people are often judged by their clothes, their job titles, or their social standing, this story challenges us to look deeper, act with kindness, and remember that respect should never be conditional. What would happen if we all chose to treat people with dignity, regardless of who they are? How different would our world be? If this story resonated with you, help share its message. Like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that remind us of the power of humility, compassion, and respect. Let's create a world where kindness always wins. Keanu Reeves quietly checked into his own luxury hotel, blending in as an ordinary guest. Unnoticed, he observed the staff and guests, but when an entitled couple humiliated a dedicated employee, he stepped out of the shadows. What happened next left everyone stunned. A confrontation that no one saw coming. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The night air was crisp as Keanu Reeves stepped through the grand revolving doors of the Horizon Skylark Hotel, a 5-star luxury haven in downtown Los Angeles. The lobby, an expanse of polished marble and soft golden lighting, exuded an air of quiet sophistication. The air smelled faintly of fresh lilies and expensive cologne, a signature scent carefully curated for high-end clientele. Outside, the city shimmered under the glow of streetlights, but inside, the world felt quieter. Hushed, expectant. Keanu moved through the space with effortless grace, dressed in a dark blazer over a slightly wrinkled t-shirt, jeans, and well-worn boots. He wasn't here to make a statement or be recognized. Quite the opposite. He had recently acquired the hotel in a private business deal, a fact known only to a handful of executives. There were no grand announcements, no press conferences. Tonight, he was just another guest, a silent observer stepping into his own empire. He took a moment to take in the details, the modern art pieces carefully placed along the walls, the grand chandelier casting an opulent glow, and the hotel staff working diligently behind the front desk. He had always believed that a person's true character revealed itself when they thought no one was watching, and that was exactly what he intended to find out. Behind the reception counter, a young man named Ethan adjusted a bouquet of fresh lilies in a tall crystal vase. Keanu immediately noticed his careful precision, the way he tilted each flower just slightly, making sure the arrangement was perfect. He was deliberate, respectful of the details. A small but significant sign of dedication. As Keanu approached the reception desk, Ethan glanced up, offering a warm but professional smile. "Good evening, sir. Checking in?" Keanu hesitated for a moment, debating whether to book a room or just observe from the lobby. Eventually, he shook his head and returned Ethan's smile. "Not yet. Just needed a quiet place to sit for a while. Long day." "Of course, sir," Ethan responded with genuine politeness. "Let me know if you need anything." Keanu nodded, then made his way to a secluded leather armchair in a softly lit corner of the lobby. He sighed, stretching out his legs as he let the day's exhaustion settle into his bones. Little did he know, the quiet of the night was about to be shattered, and what he would witness would change everything. Keanu had barely settled into the plush leather armchair when the soft chime of the elevator doors opening echoed across the quiet lobby. A well-dressed couple emerged. Damien and Victoria Langley. Their entrance alone was enough to demand attention. Damien's tailored navy blazer and expensive Italian loafers gave off an air of quiet authority, while Victoria's sleek black dress, diamond earrings, and perfectly coiffed hair exuded the effortless elegance of old money. Their presence alone seemed to shift the atmosphere in the lobby, as if they expected the world to move aside for them. Keanu had encountered their type before. Wealthy, entitled, and accustomed to impeccable service without question. He had no reason to intervene as they strutted toward the front desk, but something about their energy made him watch a little closer. Behind the reception counter, Ethan was still finishing his meticulous work, straightening a stack of check-in forms and ensuring everything was in perfect order for the late-night shift. His posture was upright, professional, but there was an unmistakable flicker of tension when he noticed the couple approaching. Victoria arrived first, pressing her manicured hands against the cool marble countertop. "You!" The word was sharp, cutting through the tranquil air like a blade. "We had room service earlier. It was unacceptable." Ethan, maintaining his calm demeanor, nodded. "I'm very sorry to hear that, ma'am. Could you tell me what the issue was?" Damien scoffed, stepping beside his wife, towering slightly over the counter. "It's not just about the food. It's about the standards here. This hotel used to be the finest in the city, but now, he gave Ethan a slow, condescending once-over. Now, I'm not so sure. Keanu's jaw tightened slightly. He had heard that tone before. The unmistakable air of someone belittling another person, not for their work, but for their presence. Ethan, to his credit, remained composed. We strive to maintain the highest standards, sir. If you could provide specifics, I'd be happy to address the matter. Victoria exhaled dramatically, as if she couldn't believe she had to spell it out. We ordered a bottle of wine, the wrong vintage was sent, and the steak overcooked. We asked for a replacement, and it took, 40 minutes? She turned to Damien for confirmation. 43, Damien corrected, shaking his head. Unacceptable for an establishment of this caliber. Ethan clasped his hands together, nodding attentively. I completely understand the frustration, and I sincerely apologize. I'll make sure our kitchen staff is aware of the mistake and that it doesn't happen again. In the meantime, I'd be happy to offer a refund for the meal or a complimentary bottle of your preferred vintage. Victoria, however, was not satisfied. Her lips pursed, eyes narrowing as she leaned in just slightly. That's not the issue, is it? Ethan blinked. Ma'am? Damien gave a knowing smirk. It's about the staff, the type of people being hired here. The previous owners understood discretion, exclusivity, but lately we've noticed. He let his sentence trail off, as if forcing Ethan to fill in the blanks. Victoria crossed her arms. Standards have slipped. And just like that, the real problem revealed itself. Keanu, from his seat, felt his muscles tense. This wasn't about food. It wasn't about service. This was about judgment. About the fact that Ethan, a hard-working young man of mixed heritage, didn't fit into their narrow, outdated perception of what luxury should look like. And, Robert said, looking around the room, Ethan's knuckles turned white against the counter, but he remained composed. If you're unhappy with our service, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting with our hotel manager tomorrow morning. I assure you, we take guest concerns seriously. But Damien's smirk deepened, and Victoria let out a quiet, scornful laugh. Oh, I think we'll be speaking to someone, but not about room service. Damien pulled out his phone, tapping rapidly on the screen before turning it around to show Ethan. A social media post. Already gathering likes, shares, and sneering comments from their followers. Keanu's stomach twisted. They had publicly shamed Ethan. We've already shared our experience. People deserve to know how this place is run these days, Victoria said with a satisfied smirk. Ethan's expression didn't waver, but Keanu could see the barely contained hurt beneath his calm professionalism. He had no defense against the weapon they had chosen, the court of public opinion. Keanu had seen enough. Slowly, he stood from his chair. The shift in the room was subtle at first. The hum of conversation in the background seemed to dull. The air itself seemed to still. Even Victoria and Damien, despite their smugness, flicked their gazes toward him as he approached the desk. Ethan looked surprised as Keanu moved beside him, standing at his shoulder like an unspoken shield. Damien furrowed his brow, clearly trying to place him. It wasn't until Victoria gasped softly, her perfectly manicured hand covering her mouth, that the realization hit. Keanu Reeves, a man known across the world, a man who had sat quietly, unseen, watching everything unfold. For the first time that night, Damien and Victoria faltered. Keanu kept his expression neutral, but his voice was cool, firm, and impossible to ignore. Would you mind showing me that post? He asked, his tone polite but commanding. Damien swallowed. What? Keanu raised an eyebrow, waiting. Slowly, Damien turned his phone around once more. The words on the screen confirmed everything Keanu had suspected. Disappointed with the decline of the once prestigious Horizon Skylark. Standards slipping, service unrefined. Staff selection is questionable at best. Would not recommend. The language was careful, not outright offensive, but full of implications, designed to cast doubt, to encourage others to sneer and nod in agreement. Keanu exhaled through his nose, his grip tightening at his sides. Then he turned to face them fully. "I should mention," he said, his voice deliberate, "that I recently purchased this hotel." Silence. Victoria went completely still. Damien's face drained of color. Keanu let the weight of his words settle in before continuing. "And since I now own it," he added, tilting his head slightly, "I'd like to have a conversation about your behavior." Damien opened his mouth. No words came out. Victoria clutched his arm, her perfectly curated poise starting to fracture. This was no longer their game to play. Keanu had taken control of the board, and neither of them had any idea what was about to happen next. The weight of Keanu's words hung in the air like a thundercloud about to break. The once smug expressions on Damien and Victoria Langley's faces had vanished, replaced by a cocktail of confusion, unease, and dawning horror. It was one thing to belittle a hotel employee, another to realize they had been doing it in front of the very man who owned the establishment. Victoria's perfectly manicured hand slowly lowered from her mouth, her mind visibly scrambling to recover from this unanticipated disaster. Damien, always the confident, self-assured businessman, opened his mouth to speak, only to close it again when he realized he had no immediate escape. Keanu's eyes never left them, his gaze unwavering, not angry, but unreadable, controlled, powerful. He had spent his entire life observing human nature, watching how people acted when they thought no one important was watching. This was one of those moments, a true test of character. Damien finally found his voice. He let out an awkward chuckle, as if trying to smooth over the tension with charm. "Mr. Reeves," he said, offering a forced smile, "this is a surprise. We had no idea you were here." Keanu nodded, his expression remaining neutral. Victoria let out a strained laugh, the kind that broke under pressure. "Well, this is certainly unexpected. We're actually huge admirers of your work." Keanu ignored the transparent attempt to shift the conversation. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Ethan, who stood beside him in quiet astonishment. The young man hadn't spoken yet, probably still processing the surreal nature of the moment. Keanu addressed Ethan directly, making sure his words carried weight. "How long have you worked here?" Ethan straightened his posture, regaining his composure despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. 5 years, sir." Keanu nodded thoughtfully, his eyes flicking back to Damien and Victoria, whose discomfort deepened with each second. "And in those 5 years," Keanu continued, his voice measured, "have you ever deliberately mistreated a guest?" Ethan shook his head. "Never, sir. I take pride in my work. I always have." Keanu knew that already. He had watched Ethan operate with grace and professionalism, despite the hostility he faced just minutes ago. But now it was time for Damien and Victoria to answer for themselves. He turned back to them, tilting his head slightly. "And in your 10 years as regular guests of this hotel, have you ever been deliberately mistreated by Ethan?" Silence. Damien's jaw tightened, his body language screaming that he did not like being put on the spot. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward her husband for some kind of cue. "Well," she started, "we wouldn't say mistreated exactly, but..." Keanu raised an eyebrow, cutting through her attempted excuse. "But..." Victoria hesitated. "It's just that we've noticed certain changes in the atmosphere." Keanu leaned forward slightly, forcing them to confront the real issue. "And by changes, you mean the type of people who work here?" Neither of them spoke, but their silence was its own confession. Keanu let the moment linger, allowing them to sit in the discomfort of their own prejudice. Then, without raising his voice, without an ounce of anger, he delivered his next words with quiet finality. "This isn't a private country club. It's a hotel. A place of service, respect, and hospitality. That applies to employees as much as it does to guests." Victoria flushed a deep red, her mouth opening and closing as if trying to find an escape route. Damien, always one to rely on power dynamics, tried one last play. Well, as paying guests, we have a certain level of expectation, and if we feel that expectation isn't met, it's our right to express dissatisfaction. That's not a crime, Mr. Reeves. Keanu studied him for a long moment before replying. No, it's not, he admitted. But using your influence to publicly humiliate someone, especially someone who did nothing wrong, isn't about dissatisfaction. It's about control. Victoria's eyes widened slightly and Damien clenched his jaw, knowing he had lost control of the conversation. Keanu gestured toward Damien's phone. Take the post down, now. Damien hesitated for half a second too long, and in that pause, Keanu's voice dropped even lower. I'm not asking. The authority in his tone left no room for argument. Slowly, stiffly, Damien pulled out his phone and deleted the post. Victoria gritted her teeth, knowing full well they had just been publicly put in their place. But Keanu wasn't finished. Now, he said, folding his arms, I'd like to know what else you plan to do to make this right. Damien stiffened, his face a mix of frustration and disbelief. Keanu had flipped the power dynamic entirely. He had forced them to acknowledge their actions, but now he was challenging them to grow from it. For the first time, Victoria looked at Ethan, not through him, not above him, but at him. And for the first time, there was shame in her gaze. She swallowed, her voice quieter now. We owe you an apology. Ethan, ever the professional, nodded once. I appreciate that. Damien exhaled sharply, swallowing his pride. Look, we'll make a statement. One that corrects what we said before. Keanu nodded approvingly. That's a start. He let the moment hang just long enough for them to realize this wasn't just a lesson for today. It was something they would carry with them moving forward. Damien and Victoria walked away in silence, their departure far less grand than their entrance. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Keanu gave him a small nod. You shouldn't have needed me to step in. That's what we're going to change. And just like that, the night took on a different tone. Not just for Ethan, not just for the staff, but for the hotel as a whole. Because things were about to change. Permanently. The lobby remained eerily silent after Damien and Victoria Langley made their uneasy retreat, their once dominant presence reduced to a mere whisper of humiliation in the grand halls of the Horizon Skylark Hotel. The air still carried the weight of their arrogance, but Keanu could feel something shifting, a quiet, unspoken victory for those who had long suffered under the entitlement of the privileged. But Keanu knew that one confrontation wasn't enough. Words fade. Gestures are forgotten, but actions shape the future. And the real work was just beginning. He turned his attention back to Ethan, who still stood behind the polished front desk, his hands pressed against the cool marble surface, as if grounding himself. Though he had remained composed throughout the ordeal, Keanu could see the exhaustion in his posture. The silent battle of pride versus survival that employees in the service industry knew all too well. You okay? Keanu asked, his voice softer now, absent of the authority he had wielded moments ago. Ethan hesitated before nodding. Yeah, he said, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. I've had worse. Keanu frowned at that. That shouldn't be normal. I'm sorry, Ethan continued, shaking his head as if to clear away the tension. I know you probably didn't come here expecting to deal with this kind of mess. Keanu offered a small, knowing smile. Actually, this is exactly why I'm here. Ethan's brows furrowed slightly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. What do you mean? Keanu leaned against the desk, his posture relaxed, but his words deliberate. I bought this hotel to see how it really runs. Not how it looks in board meetings, not how it appears in quarterly reports, but how it feels for the people who keep it running. Ethan's lips parted slightly. You mean you weren't here just to check in? Keanu shook his head. Nope. I wanted to experience it the way anyone else would. No special treatment, no formal introductions. Just the truth. A flicker of something unreadable passed through Ethan's gaze. Perhaps relief? Perhaps curiosity? So, Keanu continued, tell me the truth. Ethan hesitated, his grip tightening on the edge of the counter. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. The hotel has always had a reputation for luxury, and for the most part, we do our best to live up to it. But there's another side to it. Keanu nodded, silently encouraging him to continue. Ethan's voice lowered slightly, as if instinctively cautious despite the empty lobby. Guests like the Langleys, they aren't the exception, they're the rule. People like me, we get used to being treated as lesser, as if we're invisible until someone needs something. We're expected to take the insults, to keep smiling, to never push back, because if we do, we risk our jobs. Keanu's jaw tightened. He had expected this answer, but hearing it out loud made it all the more infuriating. And banishment? Keanu asked. Ethan hesitated before responding. They try to keep the peace. But peace, in their eyes, means keeping the high-paying guests happy at any cost, even if it means ignoring what's right. Keanu let that sink in. He had seen it before, at restaurants, at luxury boutiques, even in Hollywood itself. The belief that money could excuse cruelty, that wealth was a free pass for bad behavior. Not here, not anymore. Keanu straightened, his mind already racing through the changes that needed to be made. Starting tomorrow, he said, we're implementing a new policy. Zero tolerance for guest harassment. No more keeping the peace at the cost of your dignity. If a guest treats an employee like garbage, there will be consequences. Real ones. Ethan blinked. Wait, you mean that? Keanu met his gaze without hesitation. I don't say things I don't mean. Ethan exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. That would change everything. Keanu nodded. That's the idea. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed across the marble floor. Keanu and Ethan turned just in time to see Jacob Whitmore, the hotel's general manager, rushing toward them, his expression a mixture of concern and forced composure. Mr. Reeves, Jacob said, breathless from his sprint. I just received word about what happened with the Langleys. Keanu folded his arms. And Jacob hesitated. With all due respect, sir, they're longtime patrons. If they choose to take their business elsewhere, it could impact. Keanu held up a hand. Stop. Jacob immediately fell silent. I understand your concern, Keanu said, his tone calm but carrying a warning beneath it. But let me make something clear. If keeping the Langleys happy means allowing them to treat our staff like second-class citizens, then we don't need their money. Jacob swallowed, shifting on his feet. Of course, Mr. Reeves. I only meant... Keanu held his gaze. You meant you're used to putting profit over people. That ends now. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Jacob slowly nodded. Understood, sir. Keanu's expression softened slightly. Good, because starting tomorrow we're making this place better. For everyone. Not just the ones who can afford the penthouse suite. Ethan, who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, finally allowed himself a small smile. Because for the first time in years, it felt like the balance was shifting in the right direction. By the following morning, the tension from the previous night's confrontation had not yet faded, but something new hung in the air. A quiet buzz, an undercurrent of change. Word had spread through the hotel staff like wildfire. Keanu Reeves, the new owner, had personally stood up for one of their own. More than that, he had made it clear. Things were going to be different now. Ethan felt it the moment he stepped back into the lobby for his morning shift. The usual feeling of walking on eggshells, of wondering when the next guest would belittle him, was not as suffocating as before. Instead, there was a newfound sense of support, a knowledge that if it happened again, he wouldn't have to face it alone. As he approached the front desk, he noticed that several employees had gathered near the reception counter, murmuring among themselves. The atmosphere was different, not the usual gossip, but something else. Anticipation. Hope. Ethan adjusted his tie and approached, only to hear a familiar voice. "Not just an isolated incident," Keanu was saying, his voice calm but firm. "This is a pattern, one we need to break." Standing with a group of department heads, Keanu was leading a meeting right there in the open, not behind closed doors where decisions usually happened. He wanted the staff to hear it, to see that their concerns weren't just being acknowledged, they were being acted on. Jacob, the general manager, stood beside him, looking far more subdued than the night before. His usual corporate script, the need to keep VIPs happy, the careful balancing act of profit over ethics, had been dismantled in a single night. Ethan approached cautiously, standing near a few of his co-workers as Keanu continued. No more allowing guests to abuse staff just because they can afford to. No more turning a blind eye to discrimination. And no more making employees feel like their dignity is less valuable than a reservation. A murmur of agreement rippled through the small crowd of employees. Some of them looked downright stunned, others relieved. Keanu turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room. If anyone has ever felt afraid to speak up before, that stops now. If you're mistreated, report it. I don't care who the guest is, what their status is. Your dignity is not up for sale. Ethan didn't realize he was holding his breath. For years, they had all been trained to endure, to smile through the insults, the passive-aggressive comments, the moments of outright cruelty. That was just the reality of working in luxury hospitality. But now, standing here, watching Keanu Reeves, not just a celebrity but their boss, say these words out loud, something shifted. For the first time, it felt like they had permission to believe in something better. Keanu glanced at Jacob. "I assume we're on the same page?" Jacob straightened, nodding stiffly. "Yes, sir." Keanu gave a small nod. "Good." Then, he did something that caught everyone off guard. He turned directly to Ethan. "Ethan," he said, his voice carrying across the lobby, "I want you to be a part of this change." Ethan's breath hitched. "Me?" Keanu nodded. "You know better than anyone what it's like to deal with guests like the Langleys. I want your input on how we make things better. Not just a policy on paper, but something real." A hushed silence fell. Employees glanced at each other, the weight of Keanu's words sinking in. He wasn't just handing down orders from above. He was inviting them to be part of the solution. Ethan swallowed, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "I'd be honored." A slow, approving smile crossed Keanu's face. "Good. We'll start today." The meeting dispersed soon after, but the energy in the room was palpable. Employees who had long felt powerless were suddenly talking, sharing their experiences, brainstorming solutions. What had once been a culture of silent endurance was beginning to crack open, and something better was taking its place. By midday, the real test arrived. A man in an expensive navy suit strode into the lobby, radiating the kind of confidence that usually made employees tense. His watch gleamed under the lights, and his expression carried a practiced air of self-importance. Ethan watched as he approached the desk, preparing himself for the usual tone of entitlement. "I need a suite upgrade," the man announced. "I wasn't satisfied with the view in my current room. Completely unacceptable." Before, Ethan would have instinctively apologized, scrambling to accommodate the request, knowing that failure to do so could result in a complaint, or worse, management throwing him under the bus. But today was different. Ethan met the guest's gaze evenly. "I'm happy to look into available upgrades for you, sir," he said, his voice steady. "However, if all of our higher-tier suites are booked, I won't be able to move you. Our policies ensure fair accommodations for all guests." The man blinked, as if caught off guard. "Excuse me?" Ethan didn't flinch. He had never spoken with such directness before, but now he had a reason to. "If there's availability, I'll assist you," Ethan repeated. but I can't push another guest out of their room just to accommodate an unreasonable request." The man's brows furrowed, and for a moment, Ethan braced himself for the usual backlash. But then something strange happened. The guest paused, looked around, as if sensing that something was different in the air, that this wasn't the kind of place where he could throw a tantrum and get his way anymore. And then, without another word, he simply nodded and walked away. Ethan released a slow breath. For the first time, he hadn't just endured. He had stood his ground, and he hadn't been punished for it. Keanu, who had been watching from the side, gave him a subtle nod of approval. The first real test had been passed. That night, Keanu took a quiet moment in the now tranquil hotel lobby, sipping a coffee as he watched employees moving about with a new energy, a new confidence. Change didn't happen overnight. But tonight, it had started, and tomorrow, it would continue. By the following evening, the air inside the Horizon Skylark Hotel felt different. It wasn't something visible. There were no banners or dramatic announcements. But for those who worked there, something fundamental had shifted. Keanu sat in a quiet corner of the lobby, watching the interactions unfold. Employees who had once kept their heads down, who had swallowed their discomfort for the sake of keeping a job, now held themselves differently. They stood a little taller, spoke with a little more confidence, because now they knew someone had their back. Ethan was at the front desk, handling a guest's inquiry with a calm ease that hadn't been there before. His voice was steady, his demeanor professional, and most importantly, he wasn't afraid. Keanu took another sip of his coffee, a small smile playing on his lips. This was why he had bought the hotel, not just as another business venture, but as a place where people, both guests and staff, could be treated with the respect they deserved. As he set his cup down, movement near the entrance caught his eye. A pair of familiar figures strode through the glass doors. Morgan and Elena Langley. Keanu exhaled slowly, watching as the couple hesitated at the threshold, scanning the lobby. Gone was their smug arrogance from the night before. Now, their steps were more measured, their gazes uncertain. They were here for one reason, and one reason only: damage control. Ethan, who had also noticed their arrival, stiffened slightly behind the desk. Keanu could see the tension in his shoulders, but to his credit, he remained composed. The couple walked toward the reception, stopping just in front of the counter. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Elena cleared her throat. We'd like to check out." Ethan nodded. "Of course, ma'am. Let me process that for you." He moved efficiently, tapping at the keyboard, not offering any extra words, not placating them, not bending. Morgan glanced around, his discomfort evident. When his eyes landed on Keanu, he visibly tensed. Keanu, for his part, simply watched. He had no intention of making this easier for them. Elena fidgeted with the handle of her designer handbag. "We also wanted to say that, well, about last night," she swallowed. "We may have been too harsh." Ethan paused in his typing, glancing up at them. "Too harsh?" Morgan nodded stiffly. "Yes. We've removed the social media post, and we wanted to apologize." Silence stretched between them. Keanu let the moment linger, let them feel it. Ethan studied them for a long moment before responding. His voice was measured but firm. "You didn't just insult me," he said quietly. "You disrespected every person who works in this hotel. And if Mr. Reeves hadn't been here to witness it, you would have walked away thinking you were justified." Morgan's face flushed, and he looked down. Elena exhaled shakily. "You're right," she admitted. "We acted poorly." Ethan didn't thank them. He didn't reassure them, because their apology wasn't a gift. It was a consequence. Finally, he nodded and finished their checkout process. "Your bill is settled, you're free to go." For once, Morgan and Elena had nothing to say. They simply took their receipt, turned, and walked out of the Horizon Skylark Hotel. This time, not as guests of importance, but as two people who had been forced to face their own actions. Keanu exhaled, glancing at Ethan, who was staring after them. "You handled that well," Keanu said. Ethan let out a slow breath. It felt good not to just let it slide. Keanu gave him a small smile. "That's how it should be." The following week, Keanu called a meeting with the entire staff. Everyone from front desk attendants to housekeepers, from chefs to security. He stood before them, no fanfare, no formality, just a man who believed in something bigger than policies and profit margins. "I want you all to know something," Keanu said, his voice steady. "Respect isn't optional here, not for guests, not for staff. If you work here, you deserve to feel valued. And if you come here as a guest, you will treat the people who make this place run with the same dignity you expect in return." The employees exchanged glances, listening intently. "I'm implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination and mistreatment," Keanu continued. "If any guest crosses that line, they will be warned once. If they do it again, they will not be welcome back." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. This was unheard of. A hotel that would choose to back its staff over the demands of wealthy, entitled guests? Keanu let the weight of his words settle. The Horizon Skylark Hotel is a place of hospitality, but not at the cost of human dignity. He turned his gaze toward Ethan, then toward the housekeeping staff, the restaurant servers, the concierges, the people who had been invisible for too long. "This isn't just about fixing what happened last night," Keanu said. "It's about making sure it never happens again." For the first time, the staff applauded. And with that, a new era for the Horizon Skylark Hotel had begun. This story isn't just about Keanu Reeves standing up for an employee, it's about changing a culture. In today's world, where power and privilege often overshadow basic human respect, this moment serves as a reminder that true leadership is about standing with those who are often overlooked. Keanu's actions show that real change begins when we refuse to tolerate mistreatment, no matter who it comes from. Respect isn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It's a basic right for everyone, from hotel staff to everyday workers in all industries. What if more businesses followed this example? What if more people spoke up when they saw injustice? It starts with us. If this story inspired you, hit like, subscribe, and share so more people can hear about the power of integrity, courage, and respect. Let's make the world a place where kindness isn't just encouraged, it's expected. Keanu Reeves, known for his humility despite being one of Hollywood's most beloved actors, stepped into a luxury car dealership with quiet confidence. To him, it was just another day, a chance to admire a rare vehicle he had long been searching for. But what he didn't expect was to be judged, humiliated, and ultimately disrespected by the very people who prided themselves on selling exclusivity. What happened next would not only expose the arrogance of those who underestimated him, but also deliver a lesson in dignity and true worth that no one would soon forget. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow, we have another powerful story waiting just for you. Los Angeles was alive with its usual morning energy, horns honking, pedestrians crossing the streets with coffee in hand, and the crisp scent of freshly baked pastries wafting from corner cafes. The sun shone brightly, bouncing off the high-rises and reflecting in a million directions. But amidst the city's buzz, Keanu Reeves walked quietly, his demeanor calm and unassuming. Dressed in a well-worn black leather jacket and simple jeans, he was a stark contrast to the flashy surroundings. The weight of fame had never changed him. He still found comfort in blending into the world rather than standing atop it. As he moved through the city streets, Keanu had one particular destination in mind: Kingston Luxury Motors, a dealership renowned for its rare and exotic cars. But for him, this visit wasn't about indulgence or status. His goal was personal. For months, he had been searching for the perfect classic car, one he could restore and auction for a charity supporting underprivileged children. He wanted something with history, something that carried a story beyond its glossy exterior. Before heading to the dealership, he made his usual stop at Oliver's Cafe, a quiet spot he had frequented for years. The small shop smelled of rich espresso and warm cinnamon rolls. "Good morning, Oliver," Keanu greeted the barista with a nod. "Keanu, the usual?" Oliver asked, already reaching for the coffee pot. "The usual," Keanu confirmed with a small smile. As he sipped his coffee, his mind drifted to the search ahead. He wasn't looking for just any car. He wanted one that meant something, a relic of the past that he could breathe new life into. Finishing his drink, he left the cafe, adjusting his jacket as he stepped into the sunlight. The dealership wasn't far, and as he approached, he took in the towering glass windows that reflected the luxury within. Through the clear panels, he could already see the sleek, high-end vehicles gleaming under showroom lights, each one exuding exclusivity. Keanu took a deep breath and walked. The moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside smelled of polished leather and expensive cologne. The hum of conversation and soft classical music filled the space. Yet, as Keanu stepped forward, something else became evident. The subtle shift in attention. Employees dressed in immaculate suits barely glanced at him, but the undertone of curiosity was unmistakable. If they only knew who had just walked in. But that was the beauty of it. Keanu had never been one to flaunt his name, and today that choice would set the stage for something unforgettable. The luxury showroom exuded a cold, calculated opulence. Every inch of Kingston Luxury Motors was meticulously designed to cater to the elite, a playground for the wealthy, a space where every interaction was laced with prestige and exclusivity. Polished marble floors gleamed beneath the golden showroom lights, reflecting the flawless exteriors of exotic cars. The scent of new leather, fresh wax, and understated arrogance filled the air. Keanu stepped further into the space, his boots making soft, deliberate steps on the pristine flooring. His gaze traveled over the collection of cars, searching for something that caught his eye. There was a particular classic model he had read about, a 1969 Aston Martin DB6, known for its rich history and timeless craftsmanship. And there it was, sitting like a forgotten relic among the newer, more extravagant models. But as he moved toward it, he felt something shift. It wasn't the admiration that followed him when he walked onto a movie set. It wasn't the quiet respect he encountered when meeting fans. No, this was something entirely different. It was disdain. A salesman, a sharply dressed man with slicked-back hair and a silk tie, had noticed him. But rather than approach with enthusiasm, he hesitated, casting a glance toward the dealership's glass doors, as if checking whether Keanu had wandered in by mistake. His eyes traveled downward, scanning Keanu's faded jeans and worn jacket. His lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but a smirk of quiet amusement. Keanu, unfazed, approached him. "Excuse me?" Keanu said, his voice even. "Could you tell me more about the Aston Martin?" The salesman barely looked up from his phone. "Hang on," he muttered. Keanu waited. Seconds passed, then a full minute. The salesman exhaled heavily, as if even acknowledging the request was a burden. Without another word, he turned and walked toward a desk at the far end of the showroom. Keanu narrowed his eyes slightly but said nothing. The interaction had lasted only a few moments, but it had revealed everything. He knew this type of place, not just the physical space, but the mentality that existed here. A place where status was currency, where the weight of one's wallet determined the depth of their respect. And yet, he stayed, not out of stubbornness, but out of something deeper, a quiet curiosity about how far this situation would go. While he waited, he moved toward the Aston Martin, running his fingers along its smooth, polished exterior. There was something elegant yet raw about it, a car built in an era where craftsmanship meant more than status. He imagined what it would be like to restore it, to bring it back to life for a cause greater than himself. A whisper of conversation from nearby snapped him out of his thoughts. "Does he even know where he is?" one employee muttered. "Doubt he can afford a single bolt in this place," another chuckled. Keanu didn't react. Not yet. Then, footsteps. A man in a tailored navy suit with an air of authority approached. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he walked toward Keanu, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held a quiet judgment. This was Vincent Carter, the dealership's manager. Keanu met his gaze calmly, offering a slight nod. "Good afternoon," Keanu greeted, his tone polite. "I was hoping to learn more about this model." Vincent didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took his time studying Keanu. His gaze swept over him, not with interest, but with calculation. The kind of look that assessed whether someone was worth his time. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "This model is exclusive," Vincent said. His words were deliberate, carrying an unspoken message. Keanu smiled faintly. "That's exactly why I'm interested." A flicker of amusement flashed across Vincent's face, but it wasn't a welcoming amusement. It was mocking. "Well," Vincent continued, tilting his head slightly, "I hope you're aware this car isn't for just anyone." There it was. Keanu's eyes didn't waver. He had dealt with Hollywood executives, high-payment producers, and arrogant billionaires. He knew exactly what this was. "Good to know," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. Vincent chuckled under his breath and crossed his arms. "But tell me," Keanu continued, "who exactly is this car for?" Vincent's smirk deepened. He took a slow, calculated step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "For people who understand what they're buying," he said. "For people who belong here." The silence that followed was thick, like a challenge hanging in the air. Keanu held his gaze, unreadable. He could have ended it there, revealed who he was, shattered their assumptions in an instant. But that wasn't the point. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about how they treated people, any person who didn't fit their preconceived mold of worthiness. Keanu let the words settle before offering a quiet, knowing smile. "Interesting," he said. Vincent raised an eyebrow. Keanu stepped back from the car and slid his hands into his jacket pockets, still studying the manager. "You know," he mused, "I always thought real luxury had more to do with how you treat people than what they drive." The tension in the air thickened. Vincent's smirk faltered just slightly. Keanu gave one last glance at the Aston Martin, then back at the manager. "I'll keep looking," he said simply. And with that, he turned. But something told him this wasn't over yet. Keanu took a slow, steady step back, his hands resting in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. He could feel the tension in the air thickening, an almost palpable weight pressing down as the eyes of the showroom employees and a few scattered customers turned toward him. The hushed whispers and quiet smirks had shifted, evolving into something more dangerous. Open hostility. Vincent Carter, the dealership manager, took another step forward, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. His expression was still smug, but there was something else flickering in his eyes. A challenge, a provocation. "You should understand something, sir," Vincent began, his voice laced with feigned politeness. "We run a very exclusive business here. Our clients are people of a certain status." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his gaze never breaking from Vincent's. "And you think I don't fit that status?" Keanu asked, his voice calm, almost amused. Vincent exhaled sharply, as if frustrated that Keanu wasn't reacting the way he had expected. He crossed his arms and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so that only Keanu could hear. "Horrible, I think. People should know their place," Vincent muttered. The words hung in the air, heavier than the tension that had already settled between them. Keanu's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly inside his jacket pockets, a small, almost imperceptible movement that only someone deeply observant would have noticed. Know their place. Keanu had spent his entire life proving that kindness, humility, and respect mattered more than wealth or status. And yet, here he was, being spoken to as if he were a nobody, as if his worth could be measured by the cost of his clothes or the shine of his shoes. He took a deep breath, pushing down the frustration, refusing to let it show. "I see," Keanu said simply. Vincent smirked, mistaking Keanu's quiet response for submission. He straightened his suit, as if victorious, and turned slightly, giving a glance to one of the employees standing nearby, an unspoken signal that this problem would soon be dealt with. But before Vincent could fully turn away, Keanu spoke again. "Tell me something, Vincent," he said, his voice smooth but firm. "What would you do if I told you I could buy every single car in this dealership?" A hush fell over the room. The employees who had been quietly snickering suddenly froze. The customers, who had been idly browsing, suddenly found themselves watching, listening, waiting. Vincent blinked. For the first time since this conversation started, his composure wavered. "You," he scoffed, though there was a forced edge to it now. "You expect me to believe that?" Keanu smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Does it bother you?" he asked, tilting his head. "The idea that someone like me might have more power than you assumed?" Vincent laughed, though this time it sounded less confident, more forced. "All right, buddy, I've had enough of this little game," Vincent said, waving a dismissive hand. "I don't have time for dreamers wasting my showroom space. I think you should." And then he did it. Vincent reached forward and placed a firm hand on Keanu's shoulder, a clear sign of dismissal, a physical declaration that he was about to forcefully escort him out. The moment his fingers made contact, Keanu's entire posture shifted. It wasn't aggressive, but there was a noticeable change, a tightening of his stance, a sharp focus in his eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. It was the kind of shift that a trained fighter makes instinctively, a reflex honed through years of discipline. Vincent noticed it too, and it unsettled him. Keanu slowly, deliberately raised his hand and removed Vincent's grip from his shoulder. Not forcefully, not angrily, but with a calm dominance that sent a message loud and clear. "Don't touch me." Vincent took a step back, his face flushing red, humiliated in front of his employees and customers. His ego, already fragile from Keanu's unwavering composure, snapped. "You think you can just walk in here and act like you own the place?" Vincent hissed, his voice rising. "You don't belong here. You're a nobody in this world." The room fell silent. The words hung there, sharp as a knife. And then Vincent snapped. With a burst of rage, he swung. His fist cut through the air, aimed directly at Keanu's face. It was sloppy, fueled by emotion rather than precision, the kind of punch thrown by someone who had never truly fought a day in their life. Keanu sidestepped effortlessly. The movement was fluid, practiced, like water slipping around a stone. Vincent's momentum carried him forward too fast, and he stumbled slightly, nearly losing his balance. Keanu didn't move to strike back. He simply stood there, looking at Vincent with quiet disapproval, like a teacher watching a student fail a lesson they should have learned long ago. Vincent, breathing heavily, turned back to Keanu, eyes wild, chest heaving. But it was over. Because now, everyone in the showroom had seen exactly what kind of man Vincent was. There was no covering this up, no twisting the narrative, no way to save face. A young salesman standing near the counter, who had been filming the altercation on his phone, lowered his camera slightly. He had captured everything. The moment Vincent had tried to physically remove Keanu. The moment Keanu had stood his ground without aggression, without retaliation. And the moment Vincent had lost control completely. The silence in the dealership was no longer one of tension. It was one of realization. Vincent's face paled as he realized what had just happened. His career, his reputation, his authority, shattered in mere seconds. Keanu took a slow step forward, his voice calm but carrying absolute weight. "You're right about one thing," Keanu said quietly. "I don't belong here." Vincent swallowed hard. "Because places like this," Keanu continued, "places that judge people by their appearance instead of their character, aren't worth my time." And with that, Keanu turned on his heel and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a stunned crowd, a dealership manager who had just ruined himself, and a video that, in a matter of hours, would change everything. Because once the world saw what had happened here today, there would be no going back. Keanu walked out of the dealership without another word, his leather jacket rustling slightly as he stepped into the open air. The bright Los Angeles sunlight contrasted sharply with the heavy tension he had left behind inside. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Inside the dealership, the silence was suffocating. Employees stood frozen, unsure of what to do, their eyes darting between Vincent, whose face was still flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation, and the young salesman, Tyler, who was clutching his phone with wide, disbelieving eyes. He had recorded everything. Tyler, a junior employee who had only been working at the dealership for a few months, felt his heart pounding against his ribs. His fingers trembled slightly as he looked down at the screen, replaying the footage he had instinctively captured. The way Vincent had sneered at Keanu, the arrogant dismissal, the way he had tried to put his hands on him, and then, the moment everything changed. What? The punch. The instant Vincent had snapped, losing every ounce of professionalism, proving with his own actions exactly who he really was. Tyler swallowed hard. He had seen his boss be rude before. Condescending, elitist, dismissive, but never like this. Never violent. He glanced around the showroom, catching the uncertain looks on the faces of his coworkers. Some were still shocked, others were trying to pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. The customers, however, weren't pretending. A couple near the front desk whispered frantically to each other. A man in a designer suit checked his phone as if already posting about the incident, and a woman near the entrance stood stiff as a board, her lips slightly parted as if she couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. Then, the notification. Tyler's phone buzzed in his hand. New message, group chat, sales team. Please tell me someone got that on video. Did Vincent just try to punch Keanu Reeves? Dude, that video's going viral. Tyler's breath caught. Viral. His hands moved before his mind could catch up. With a few quick taps, he saved the video to his phone and sent it into the private employee group chat. Within seconds, responses flooded in. Holy crap, Tyler, this is insane. I just showed my cousin. He says it's going to blow up online. Dude, someone already posted it on Twitter. Tyler's fingers froze over the keyboard. Already posted? He switched apps, heart hammering, scrolling until he found it. A short 25-second clip, the caption shouting at him. Car dealership manager tries to throw Keanu Reeves in. Underneath, the view count climbed rapidly. 5,000. 1, 500, 0. 2, 3, 0, 0, 0. The numbers skyrocketed every time he blinked. Comments flooded in, thousands pouring in by the second. Who the hell treats Keanu like this? Vincent is done. Just wait until the world sees this. Bro really tried to punch John Wick. He better start running. Tyler exhaled sharply, his stomach twisting into a knot. Vincent was finished. He turned his gaze toward his boss, who had begun pacing back and forth, palms pressed to his forehead, his breathing ragged. He didn't know yet. He didn't realize the magnitude of what had just happened. But he was about to. A loud ping came from the front desk. One of the receptionists gasped. Mr. Carter? She called hesitantly. Vincent whipped around, already irritated. What? You might want to check your phone. His brows furrowed as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his pristine, high-end smartphone. His fingers swiped across the screen, and then he stopped. The color drained from his face. His inbox was flooded with messages, missed calls, emails. Even his social media notifications had exploded. Vincent, what the hell happened at the dealership? You're trending online and not in a good way. Call me back. Then, the worst message of all. From the owner of the dealership. We need to talk, immediately. Vincent's hand tightened around his phone, his entire body stiffening. His mouth opened slightly as if to say something, but no words came out. For the first time in his career, Vincent Carter, the man who had built his reputation on power, status, and wealth, realized he was completely powerless. The weight of it hit him like a truck. He turned slowly, scanning the room, and only then did he truly notice how every pair of eyes in the dealership was locked onto him. No one was laughing now. No one was pretending. They were just watching. Because they all knew. The arrogant manager who had spent years looking down on people was now the man everyone looked down upon. And there was no escaping it. Vincent's jaw clenched. He wanted to scream, to deny it, to fix what had just happened. But there was no fixing this. Outside, the world was already watching. And inside the dealership, it was only a matter of time before everything he had built came crashing down. Outside the dealership, Keanu Reeves walked down the busy Los Angeles Boulevard, his expression unreadable. He had no idea how quickly the events inside that showroom were already exploding across the internet. The sun reflected off the pavement. Pedestrians passed him without a second glance, and for a moment, everything felt normal, as if what had just happened was already behind him. But the world had other plans. Inside the dealership, chaos erupted. Vincent Carter stood frozen in front of his office desk, his phone buzzing non-stop, each notification a nail in the coffin of his reputation. He had seen plenty of crises in his career. Angry customers, tough negotiations, even a few bad reviews. But this was different. This was viral. He gritted his teeth, staring at the screen. News outlets had already picked up the story. Social media was in flames. Luxury dealership manager attacks Keanu Reeves. His response? Pure class. Man disrespects Keanu Reeves, instantly regrets it. Keanu faces elitism in LA car dealership. Fans rally behind him. And then, the worst headline of them all. Hollywood's nicest guy gets kicked out kick after kick out. But wait until you see what happens next. Vincent's breath hitched. He scrolled faster, hands shaking as he read the comments flooding every post. Did this guy really try to throw out Keanu Reeves? Does he know who he just messed with? Keanu could buy the whole dealership if he wanted, but instead, he just left with dignity. That manager? Done. Vincent Carter should start packing his bags because this dealership is never recovering from this. And then, the email. From corporate. Vincent's stomach sank. Board meeting. 5 p.m. Urgent. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. They knew. And if they knew, then that meant... His door slammed open. Vincent, what the hell is going on? It was Charles McKenna, the dealership's owner, an older man with silver hair, a reputation twice as powerful as Vincent's, and an expression so furious it could shatter glass. He tossed a printed email onto Vincent's desk. Care to explain why my flagship dealership is the center of a public relations disaster? McKennan's voice was ice. Vincent swallowed hard. Charles, it's not as bad as... McKenna cut him off. Not as bad? His voice boomed through the office. Do you have any idea how much damage control I've had to do in the last 2 hours? Do you know how many high-profile clients have canceled their appointments? He slammed a stack of printouts onto the desk. Read those. Cancellations. Dozens. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue because of you. Vincent's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. McKenna exhaled sharply, trying to calm himself. But the anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He leaned forward, his tone now dangerously low. Keanu Reeves didn't just walk into this dealership, Vincent. He walked in with the intention of buying something, and you, he jabbed a finger toward him, made him feel like he didn't belong. Silence hung heavy between them. You think the public is going to forgive that? McKenna continued. You think this company can survive being known as the place that disrespected Keanu Reeves? Vincent stared at the floor, his mind racing for a way to spin the situation. But there was nothing. The internet had already judged him, and... Keanu? Keanu hadn't said a single word publicly, and that was what made it worse. No interviews, no tweets, no statements. Nothing. Just silence. And yet the world had rallied around him anyway. Vincent's fingers clenched into fists. The realization hit him like a truck. He had spent years believing power came from status, wealth, and control. But in one afternoon, Keanu had proven him wrong. By doing nothing at all. McKenna shook his head. I have no choice, Vincent. He straightened, adjusting his cuffs. The board has already voted. You're being terminated immediately. Vincent's head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. Wait, you can't. McKenna raised a hand, stopping him cold. It's done. The words landed like a death sentence. Vincent felt his entire world collapse around him. The empire he had built on arrogance, elitism, and ego had just been ripped away in an instant. And Keanu Reeves? Keanu was still walking the streets of LA, completely unbothered, his reputation untouchable, while Vincent's name was now synonymous with failure. As security arrived to escort him out, Vincent gave one final glance at the showroom floor. Employees whispered behind their hands. Some smirked. Others looked away, unwilling to meet his gaze. Tyler, the young salesman who had filmed everything, held up his phone, the screen still playing the very video that had sealed Vincent's fate. The door shut behind him, and just like that, Vincent Carter was gone. Keanu Reeves had always believed that true wealth wasn't measured by possessions, but by the way people treated each other. That belief had never wavered, not even as he stood outside the very dealership that had humiliated him just days ago. The world had already decided Vincent Carter's fate, but Keanu wasn't here for revenge. He was here for something bigger. A lesson. The glass doors of the dealership slid open as Keanu stepped inside once more, but this time there was no mockery, no disdainful whispers. The employees froze, their faces a mix of shock and unease. They had all seen the viral video, the fallout, the news articles dissecting every moment, and now, the man they had judged too quickly, the man they had dismissed, had returned. A nervous assistant manager, a man who had barely acknowledged Keanu last time, hurried forward with an awkward smile. Mr. Reeves, welcome back. Can we help you? Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. I'd like to see the same car, he said simply. The assistant hesitated, glancing toward the showroom floor. The luxury vehicle, the one that had sparked the entire ordeal, was still parked in its pristine display. But Vincent was gone now, and the dealership's prestige had been shattered overnight. The business had suffered immense backlash, and high-profitable clients had abandoned it, all because of one mistake. Mistaking arrogance for power. Swallowing hard, the assistant nodded. Of course, sir. Right this way. Keanu walked toward the car, the very same one Vincent had tried to keep away from him. He ran his hand over its surface again, but this time he wasn't just admiring the vehicle. He was making a point. The remaining employees gathered at a distance, watching, holding their breath. Would he buy it? Would he forgive? Or would he do something they'd never expect? Keanu turned, his gaze sweeping the room. Finally, he spoke. I could buy this car right now, he said, his voice calm but firm. I could take it home today, but I won't. The room tensed. I won't because this place, he gestured around the showroom, lost something far more valuable than a sale. It lost respect. Not just for me, but for anyone who doesn't fit a certain profile. A few employees looked away, ashamed. Respect is free, Keanu continued, his voice carrying across the silent room. But for some reason, it seems harder to find than any car in here. He took a step back from the vehicle, letting his words sink in. Then, after a long pause, he delivered the final blow. I found another dealership, one that values people over status, and that's where I'll be taking my business. Without another word, Keanu turned and walked toward the exit. As the glass doors slid open and the sunlight bathed him in its glow, the weight of his words settled over the showroom like an unshakable truth. Keanu Reeves had left something far more powerful than his money behind. He had left a lesson, one the world would never forget. The dealership doors closed behind Keanu Reeves, but the weight of his words lingered like an unshakable storm. Inside, employees stood in stunned silence, their faces pale with realization. They had just lost more than a sale. They had lost their reputation, their integrity, and their dignity. No luxury car, no high-prefaced clients could erase the truth that had just been spoken. Meanwhile, outside, Keanu walked with quiet confidence, the LA sun glinting off his black leather jacket. He had no regrets. He had left behind a message that would echo far beyond the showroom, a message about respect, humility, and true worth. However, Keanu wasn't done yet. A few miles away, nestled in a quiet, family-run dealership, the atmosphere was vastly different. There were no pretentious gazes, no hushed whispers of judgment. Instead, there was genuine warmth, the kind that welcomed everyone, whether they arrived in a suit or a simple jacket. Keanu entered with ease, greeted by an older gentleman named Frank, the dealership's owner. Frank wasn't dazzled by fame. He simply saw a man interested in a car. "Welcome in, son. What can I do for you?" Frank asked with a kind smile. Keanu returned the smile, appreciating the sincerity. "I'm looking for something special," he replied. "A car that's more than just a machine, something with history, with meaning." Frank nodded, understanding immediately. "Then I have just the thing." He led Keanu to a classic model, one that had been cared for, restored with love. It wasn't about flash or extravagance, but about craftsmanship, soul, and authenticity. Keanu knew immediately this was the car. He ran his hand along its surface, feeling the story it carried, the legacy embedded in every curve and detail. This was the kind of purchase that mattered, the kind of investment that wasn't about status but about purpose. "I'll take it," Keanu said, without hesitation. Frank grinned. "You got yourself a deal?" As Keanu signed the paperwork, a small crowd of employees gathered, not because they were in awe of his fame, but because they respected the way he carried himself. There was no arrogance, no need to prove anything, just a man making an honest purchase in a place where people mattered more than money. As Keanu drove off in his newly purchased car, he didn't just leave with a vehicle. He left with something even more powerful, the confirmation that true worth isn't in wealth, but in the way we treat one another. Keanu Reeves' encounter at the luxury car dealership was more than just an unfortunate case of misjudgment. It was a powerful reminder that true worth is not measured by wealth, clothing, or appearances, but by character and the way we treat others. The dealership manager, blinded by arrogance, failed to recognize the integrity standing right in front of him. His assumptions cost him not just a sale, but his reputation, his credibility, and the respect of countless people who witnessed his actions. Yet Keanu did what he always does. He turned the situation into an opportunity to inspire change. Instead of retaliating with anger, he used the moment to send a message about dignity and respect. By choosing to take his business elsewhere, to a place that valued honesty over status, he proved that kindness and humility will always hold more power than arrogance and superficiality. This story is not just about Keanu Reeves, it's about all of us. How often do we judge others based on appearances? How often do we assume someone's worth without truly knowing them? This is a lesson we can carry into our own lives, to choose kindness, to treat others with respect, and to remember that true luxury lies not in possessions, but in how we make people feel. If you believe the world needs more respect and humility, share this story. And remember, the way we treat people defines who we